There is a location buried inside Ark Raiders lore that almost nobody talks about in full, a place called Blue Gate. And once you understand what actually happened there, every other piece of this story clicks into place in a way that genuinely changes how you see the entire world of Ark Raiders. I want to take a second before we get into it to explain why I made this video and what I was going for when I put it together. I've been sitting on this one for a while, honestly. The lore of Ark Raiders is one of those things where the more you dig, the more you realise how much of it is scattered across environmental details, radio transmissions, loading screen fragments, and item descriptions that most players never stop to read. Blue Gate kept coming up in pieces, never in full, and I thought that was worth fixing. When I was assembling this video, I made a deliberate choice to lead with the human side of the story rather than the mechanical or tactical side, because I think that's where the emotional weight actually lives. I also chose to leave out some of the more speculative community theories that don't have a real anchor in the game's actual materials, because I wanted this to feel grounded. What you're hearing is my reading of the lore, shaped by everything I could find, but I'll use language that reflects that. This is interpretation. This is one way to read what the game is telling us. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Now let's get into it. Chapter 1. The World That Ended Quietly. The world did not end with a bang, at least not at first. One of the things that Ark Raiders lore seems to want you to understand before anything else is that the catastrophe it depicts did not arrive with dramatic fanfare in a single moment. The evidence scattered throughout the game's environments suggests something slower, something that crept in at the edges of human civilization before most people even understood what they were looking at. The transmissions you find in the game, the ones that predate the main events by years, point toward a period of confusion rather than immediate panic. The earliest fragments of information available in the game's collected materials suggest that the first confirmed sightings of Ark activity happened not over major cities, but over remote locations, desert stretches, high-altitude mountain ranges, the deep ocean in areas that civilian radar and satellite coverage barely touched. This detail is important because it explains why the initial response was so fragmented. There was no single government, no single military command, no single intelligence apparatus that had a complete picture of what was happening in those early months. You find references in the lore to a period that survivors in the underground communities refer to simply as the Grey Years. This was the stretch of time between the first confirmed anomalies and the moment when the scale of the Ark presence became undeniable to ordinary people. The Grey Years are described differently, depending on who is doing the describing. Older survivors who were adults during that period tend to describe it with a kind of flat, exhausted regret, the sense of people who knew something was wrong and did not know how to act on that knowledge. What makes the Grey Years so interesting from a lore perspective is that they suggest human institutions were still functioning, still attempting to contain and explain what was happening. There are references to international scientific bodies convening emergency sessions. There are fragments of what appear to be classified briefing documents, partially corrupted, that describe initial attempts to analyze the objects that would eventually be understood as Ark units. The language in those fragments is cautious, almost sterile, the language of people trying very hard not to say the thing they were thinking. The Ark objects themselves, in their earliest appearances in the lore record, are not described as machines in the way we understand machines. The initial documentation points toward them being described as phenomena, a word that tells you something important about how disorienting the early encounters were. People who had trained their whole lives to identify and categorize threats were looking at something that did not fit any of their categories, and the language they used reflected that. There is a recurring motif in the environmental storytelling of Ark Raiders that I think is easy to miss if you're moving through areas quickly. You find personal objects left in contexts that suggest interrupted routines, a meal half eaten, a workstation with multiple windows still open on a task that was never completed, a child's drawing left on a refrigerator with a note that references a school event scheduled for a date that would never come. These are not accidental details in a game this deliberate about its world building. They are telling you something about the texture of how the world ended. The texture was mundane. That seems to be the point. The world that ended was not a world already primed for apocalypse. It was a world full of people doing ordinary things, making ordinary plans, operating under the assumption that tomorrow would resemble today. The Ark arrivals disrupted that assumption, not all at once, but in a series of escalating intrusions, each one larger and more disruptive than the last, each one forcing a new recalibration of what was possible and what was survivable. Early Ark behaviour, as reconstructed from the lore fragments, was not immediately hostile in the way you might expect from a traditional invasion narrative. This is one of the more interesting and unsettling aspects of the game's world building. The early Ark units were not attacking population centres. They were not engaging military installations. They were doing something else, something that the survivors and researchers who came later would spend enormous effort trying to understand, and that something was collection. The game points toward the idea that early Ark activity was primarily focused on resource identification and extraction, not the resources a human strategist would target, not oil fields or water supplies or agricultural zones, at least not initially. The early collection activity suggested in the lore involves more unusual materials, geological samples from specific formation types, atmospheric measurements, and something else that multiple lore fragments circle around without directly naming, something related to biological material. When you start reading the lore of Ark Raiders with this in mind, the horror of it lands differently. This was not an invasion in the traditional sense, at least not at first. It was more like a survey. And the thing about being surveyed is that it does not feel like violence, even when it is the prelude to violence. The people living through those early years were trying to respond to something that did not yet look like a threat in any category they had language for. Military responses during the Grey Years, according to the available fragments, were deeply inconsistent. Some nations scrambled jets and attempted intercept protocols. Some of those intercepts resulted in no engagement at all because the Ark units simply did not respond to the aircraft the way a conventional hostile object would. Some resulted in engagements that went poorly for the human side, not because the Ark units were aggressively defensive, but because attempting to interact with them physically turned out to be dangerous in ways that were not fully understood until multiple incidents had already occurred. The lore suggests that early casualty events were therefore accidental in a specific way. Not accidental in the sense of being unintended by any party, but accidental in the sense that they were the result of human initiative, rather than Ark aggression. Humans made contact, humans attempted intervention, humans sustained losses, and the Ark units continued doing whatever they were doing, apparently indifferent to the encounters. This indifference is one of the most persistent and disturbing notes in the game's lore, and it runs all the way through to the events at Blue Gate. The sense that human action was at some fundamental level not really factored into whatever the Ark was doing. Not because humanity was beneath consideration in a contemptuous sense, but because the Ark was operating according to a logic that human frameworks for conflict and negotiation simply did not map onto. Underground communities in the game world frequently reference this indifference when they're trying to explain the psychological impact of the Ark years on their populations. It is one thing to be attacked by an enemy that hates you. That kind of threat at least validates your existence, confirms that you're seen and considered a problem worth solving. The Ark's apparent indifference was, according to the fragments, something much harder to process emotionally and psychologically. The organisational response to the Ark situation, such as it was, took years to coalesce into anything resembling a coherent strategy. The law points toward a series of failed international frameworks, committees and coalitions that dissolved under the pressure of competing national interests, even as the threat expanded. There are references to moments where genuine cooperation seemed possible, followed by collapses that the survivors describing them sound genuinely bitter about decades later. What emerged from this period of fragmented response was not a unified human resistance in the dramatic sense. It was something more improvised and more fragile. A patchwork of local organisations, some military in origin, some civilian, some a mixture of both, that began developing their own protocols for operating in proximity to Ark activity. These organisations would eventually become the ancestors of the raider communities you encounter in the game, but in their earliest forms, they were much less organised, much less equipped, and operating with much less information than they would eventually accumulate. The knowledge economy that developed around Ark activity during this period is one of the more fascinating threads in the lore. Information about Ark behaviour and capabilities became enormously valuable because it was both scarce and practically important. People who had direct experience with Ark encounters were sought out. People who had managed to record or document Ark activity had leverage. This created dynamics that the lore suggests were often exploitative, with larger and better resourced organisations extracting knowledge from smaller groups without adequate compensation or protection. One of the things that the lore consistently returns to when describing this period is the concept of the learning curve and how steep and costly it was. Every piece of genuine understanding about Ark behaviour came at a price, usually paid in human lives. The people who survived long enough to transmit what they had learned were a small fraction of the people who had attempted to gather the information in the first place. This created a kind of survivor bias in the accumulated knowledge base, where the information that survived was specifically the information that could be gathered by people who were lucky enough, careful enough, or well-resourced enough to survive the gathering. The physical landscape of the game world carries this history in its bones. You move through environments that show the layered aftermath of different periods of human response and abandonment. There are military installations that were built during the organised response phase, then stripped for parts and abandoned when the organisations that built them collapsed. There are civilian settlements that were established in what seemed like safe zones and then had to be evacuated when those zones turned out not to be safe. There are research facilities where someone tried to understand what was happening and left behind the evidence of that attempt. The game does not show you the world before very often, and when it does, it is through the mediated lens of found materials rather than direct depiction. But what those materials collectively suggest is a world that was, in many ways, ordinary before it stopped being ordinary. The technology was familiar. The social structures were recognisable. The concerns people were navigating before the Ark arrived were the concerns of a modern, complicated, imperfect human world. This ordinariness is important to keep in mind as we move forward into the more specific events of the lore, including the events at Blue Gate. Because the people who ended up fighting at Blue Gate were not characters in an epic fantasy. They were people shaped by a world that had been ordinary and then had been devastated, and they were carrying the weight of that transition in ways the lore makes visible if you look for them. The settlements that survived the worst of the grey years and the initial period of high Ark activity did so through a combination of factors that the lore presents as partially strategic and partially fortunate. Geographic isolation helped. Underground or heavily shielded locations helped. Small enough population concentrations to avoid drawing significant Ark attention helped. But across all the survivor accounts and fragments, there is also a consistent acknowledgement that luck played a larger role than anyone was entirely comfortable admitting. Food systems in the post-Ark world, as depicted in the lore, underwent radical transformation. The surface was not uniformly inaccessible, but it was inaccessible enough that large-scale agriculture, of the kind modern civilization had depended on, was no longer viable in most areas. The lore references extensive development of underground growing operations, hydroponic systems, fungal cultivation, and other approaches that could function with minimal surface exposure. These systems were often fragile and technically demanding, and their maintenance became one of the central concerns of surviving communities. Medical infrastructure degraded significantly and unevenly. The game's lore suggests that pharmaceutical supply chains collapsed early and were never fully replaced, leading to a kind of tiered medical reality where communities with better access to surface salvage had meaningfully better health outcomes than communities without it. This created another dimension of the survival economy that shaped raider culture in ways that go well beyond simple resource acquisition. The psychological literature of the post-Ark world, to the extent that it exists in the lore fragments, is genuinely sobering to read. There are references to what appear to be community mental health reports, the kind of documentation that suggests organized communities trying to track and respond to psychological distress at a population level. The patterns they describe are what you would expect from prolonged exposure to catastrophic threat, but the specific textures are shaped by the particular nature of the Ark threat in ways that make them distinct from historical trauma literature. Children born after the worst of the Ark disruptions, the first fully post-Ark generation, appear in the lore as a category that the surviving adults discuss with a mixture of protectiveness and uncertainty. These were children who had never known the world before, for whom the underground and the careful surface expeditions and the constant presence of Ark activity were simply the conditions of existence, rather than a departure from something else. The lore suggests that these children processed the world differently, and that this difference was sometimes a source of tension between generations. Raider culture, as it emerged from these conditions, was not simply about physical survival, although it was certainly about that. It was also about the maintenance of a specific relationship to the surface, to the world above and outside the settlements, that served psychological and social functions beyond the material. Going to the surface was dangerous. Going to the surface was also the act that most clearly connected people to the world that had existed before, and to the possibility that something might eventually change. Raiders were not just scavengers. They were, in a real sense, the people who maintained humanity's claim to the surface world. The technical knowledge required for raiding evolved rapidly through the early post-Ark years. What worked in one area did not necessarily work in another. Ark unit behavior varied in ways that were not fully understood, and the margin for error on surface operations was small enough that improvisational problem-solving was a survival skill as much as any specific piece of technical training. The raider knowledge base that accumulated over these years was practical, hard-won, and treated with enormous respect within communities that understood how it had been obtained. The communication networks that connected different communities were intermittent and often unreliable, but they existed and they mattered. The lore references radio systems maintained at significant cost and effort, courier routes that were dangerous but maintained because the alternative was complete isolation, and occasional larger gatherings that served both informational and social functions. These networks were the arteries of the surviving human world, and they were how information about Ark activity and about locations like Bluegate eventually moved between communities. Power generation in the post-Ark world is one of the more practically interesting threads in the lore. Nuclear facilities that had been designed to run with minimal surface exposure turned out to be among the more durable pieces of pre-Ark infrastructure, and communities fortunate enough to be near-functioning facilities had significant advantages. Others developed smaller-scale solutions, geothermal where it was accessible, carefully managed fuel cells, and eventually more sophisticated systems, as technical knowledge was rebuilt and consolidated. The energy economy of the post-Ark world shaped almost everything else about it. The Ark units themselves, over the years following the initial period, became more thoroughly mapped and categorized by the communities and organizations studying them. The lore presents this as an ongoing, never-finished process, because Ark behavior was not fully static, and because the information required to update the understanding of it came at the same costs it always had. But the picture that emerged over time was more detailed and more unsettling than the initial picture, because more detail meant more understanding of the scale of what the Ark was doing. The scale, as understood by the deeper lore, is genuinely staggering. The Ark was not a fleet of ships. It was not a conventional invasion force in any sense that human military doctrine had frameworks for. The lore suggests something more like a system, vast and distributed, and operating according to an internal logic that was partially mapped but never fully decoded. The units encountered by raiders and military forces were components of something much larger, and the activity visible on the surface was only a portion of what the Ark was doing. Subterranean Ark activity is referenced in the lore in ways that are deliberately incomplete, suggesting that the information available to surface communities was itself only partial. There are hints of Ark infrastructure that extended underground, not in the same spaces as human settlements, but in deeper strata that human activity had never reached. What was happening in those depths is not clearly described, but the fragments that reference it carry a particular weight, the weight of something important that is not fully understood. Communication with the Ark was attempted multiple times during the post-establishment period, according to the lore fragments. These attempts are described with a range of tones, from the formal and procedural language of official reports to the raw, sometimes desperate language of individuals who were trying to do something that mattered. None of the described attempts resulted in what any reasonable definition would call communication. Some resulted in unusual Ark responses that the interpreting humans found ambiguous. Some resulted in nothing. Some resulted in outcomes that were not good. The question of Ark intelligence and intentionality is one that the game's lore treats with notable care. It does not give you a clean answer. The fragments suggest that the question was debated intensely within surviving communities and research organizations, not as an abstract philosophical question, but as a practical one with real stakes. If the Ark was acting according to a kind of intelligence, then communication might eventually be possible, which had certain implications. If the Ark was operating more like a natural process, an enormously complex but ultimately non-intentional system, then different approaches were indicated. The debate never resolved cleanly, and the lore's refusal to resolve it on the player's behalf is one of its more thoughtful decisions. You are left, as the player and viewer, with the same uncertainty the characters lived with. The Ark is doing something. The Ark has been doing it for a long time. What it means and what it intends, and whether intend is even the right word, those questions remain open. Into this long, complicated, uncertain world, the events at Blue Gate arrived as a specific kind of crisis, one that forced some of those open questions toward a moment of decision, even if they could not be fully answered. Blue Gate was not the only significant location in the arc of the lore, so to speak, but it was the one where multiple threads converged in a way that made it a pivot point for everything that followed. Understanding what happened at Blue Gate requires understanding who the major players were, what they wanted, what they knew, and what they were willing to do. It requires understanding the specific geography and what made that location significant. It requires following several threads of the lore backward through their histories before following them forward to their meeting point. That is what we are going to do in this video. But before we go there, it is worth sitting with this first chapter a little longer, because the world described here, the slow erosion of the familiar, the improvised survival, the hard-won knowledge, the persistent uncertainty, was the world that produced the people who ended up at Bluegate. It was the world that made them who they were, gave them their capabilities and their limitations, their alliances and their wounds. The people at Bluegate were not heroes, in a story that had always been heading toward a heroic climax. They were people shaped by decades of difficult living in a world that had already taken most of what it was going to take from them. That context does not make what happened at Bluegate less significant. It makes it more significant because it means understanding what they were carrying when they got there. One last thing before we move forward from this foundational chapter. The game's lore, and by extension this video, does not present humanity as a monolith. The communities and organizations and individuals whose stories intersect at Bluegate were not a unified force with a single agenda. They were people with competing interests and real grievances and histories that complicated their ability to act together. The tension between those competing interests is part of the story of Bluegate, and it will come up again and again as we get deeper into it. The world was broken, and the people in it were complicated, and something very important was about to happen. Let's keep going. Chapter 2. Who were the raiders, and why did it matter? The term raider in the world of Ark Raiders carries a lot of freight. It is not a neutral descriptor, and it was not originally a self-chosen identity. The lore suggests that the word emerged from outside the communities that would eventually adopt it, initially used as a somewhat dismissive term by more established or conservative survivor groups to describe the people who went to the surface regularly and built their lives around that practice. The fact that the raider communities eventually claimed the term says something about the kind of culture they developed. To understand Bluegate and the events leading to it, you need to understand raider culture from the inside, not just as a label applied from outside. The lore provides enough material to do this, though it requires assembling fragments from multiple sources. What emerges from that assembly is a picture of a culture that was internally coherent, that had its own values and hierarchies and traditions, and that understood itself in specific ways that shaped how its members made decisions when they mattered most. The foundational value of raider culture, as reconstructed from the lore, was competence. Not competence in an abstract sense, but demonstrated field-proven competence in the specific environment of surface operations. This value was not arbitrary. It emerged from the practical reality that incompetence in the surface environment had lethal consequences, not just for the individual, but for everyone operating with them. The premium placed on demonstrated skill was therefore both a cultural preference and a survival mechanism. Related to this was a deep suspicion of authority that was not grounded in demonstrated capability. The lore fragments from raider communities are notably critical of hierarchies that derived their legitimacy from pre-Ark credentials or inherited status, rather than from what people could actually do in current conditions. This is not a universal feature of all post-Ark survivor communities, some of which maintained more traditional authority structures, but it is a persistent feature of specifically raider communities, and it shaped how they interacted with other groups. The relationship between raider communities and the larger settlements they supplied was complicated in ways the lore does not smooth over. Raiders provided essential materials that underground settlements could not easily obtain otherwise. This gave them leverage, but it also made them dependent on settlement markets for the things they needed that could not be found on the surface. The lore describes a range of these relationships, from genuinely cooperative arrangements that worked well for both parties to extractive dynamics where larger settlements used their position to suppress raider compensation for the risks they took. There is a thread in the lore that describes the development of raider guilds, or collectives, organizations that attempted to address the power imbalance between individual raiders and large settlements by consolidating the negotiating power of multiple raider operators. These organizations had mixed success, and their stories are not simple triumph narratives. Some of them were eventually co-opted by the same settlement interests they were created to resist. Some of them developed their own internal hierarchies that reproduced some of the problems they were trying to solve. A few managed to hold on to their founding purposes through sustained effort. The knowledge culture of raider communities was distinctive, and from a lore perspective, genuinely interesting. The premium placed on experiential knowledge meant that the ways knowledge was transmitted and validated were different from what you would find in more formally educated communities. Mentorship relationships were central. Direct demonstration mattered more than verbal or written explanation. The result was a knowledge culture that was in some ways deeply conservative because you did not change a practice that was keeping people alive without very strong evidence that the change was an improvement, and in other ways highly adaptive, because the practical demands of surface operations required constant problem solving. Navigation in the post-arc surface environment is a topic the lore touches on repeatedly, and it reveals something important about what raiders actually dealt with on a day-to-day basis. The familiar landmarks of the pre-arc world were still there, mostly, but they were transformed. Infrastructure that had served as reliable navigation references had often been damaged or moved or obscured. Arc unit presence created areas that required route alteration. Environmental changes resulting from years of arc activity had modified terrain in some places significantly. Raiders who operated in a given area developed extremely detailed local knowledge, and that knowledge was guarded and shared according to community norms that were taken very seriously. The psychological profile of successful long-term raiders, as described in the lore fragments and survivor accounts, is notably specific. Tolerance for sustained uncertainty was essential. The ability to make good decisions under conditions of incomplete information and time pressure was essential. Emotional regulation under conditions that would traumatize most people was essential. What is perhaps most interesting is that the lore does not romanticize these qualities. It describes them as adaptations to a demanding environment acquired at cost, and it acknowledges the cost. There are multiple references in the lore to what is described in different ways by different sources, but that amounts to burnout in the raider context. The specific form it takes is a loss of the risk calibration ability that characterizes effective raider operation. You start making decisions that are objectively worse than decisions you would have made earlier in your operational career. Not because your technical skills have degraded, but because some internal mechanism that was doing important work has stopped doing it reliably. The communities that understood this treated it as a real phenomenon requiring real response. The communities that did not understand it or did not have the resources to respond to it lost people unnecessarily. Children who grew up in raider communities developed differently than children in more conventional settlement environments, according to the lore. Not worse, the lore is careful not to suggest that, but differently. There is a fragment that describes a researcher from a non-raider community observing children in a raider settlement and noting that the way they played incorporated surface environment elements in ways that the researcher found surprising, the same way that children in any community incorporate their real environment into their imaginative play. The researcher's surprise is revealing about the assumptions they brought with them. The specific equipment and material culture of raider communities is described in the lore with a level of detail that suggests someone who found it genuinely interesting to document. The modifications made to standard equipment for surface use, the improvised solutions for problems that off-the-shelf solutions did not adequately address, the specific ways that equipment was maintained and repaired given the scarcity of replacement parts. All of this points to a material culture that was creative and resourceful in ways that were directly linked to survival requirements. Communication protocols within raider teams are described in some detail in the lore, and they are worth noting because they tell you something about the operational environment. Verbal communication was often restricted in arc proximate areas because sound carried and arc unit responses to sound were not fully predictable. Teams developed gesture and signal systems that could convey necessary operational information without vocal communication. These systems varied between communities and even between teams, which created integration challenges when groups from different origins had to work together. The lore presents several specific raider characters whose histories illuminate different aspects of raider culture and experience. Without naming any single one as definitively canonical, because the game presents multiple perspective characters and the lore does not establish a single protagonist in the traditional sense, the collected character histories point toward common formative experiences. Almost all of the extended character backgrounds involve loss, which is not surprising given the world, but the specific patterns of how that loss was processed and incorporated are varied and psychologically plausible. One character history that appears in multiple fragments references an individual who was among the first generation of raiders to have no pre-arc memories, and whose entire understanding of the world was shaped by post-arc conditions. This character's account of learning about the pre-arc world through found materials and older community members' stories has a quality that is genuinely interesting from a perspective of how historical knowledge is transmitted. The pre-arc world, to this character, was something like a mythology, vivid and important but fundamentally not experiential, not something they could access through their own memory. The institutional structures that emerged among raider communities over the long post-arc years were diverse, reflecting the diversity of the communities themselves and the different environments they operated in. Some communities organized around a council model with formal procedures, some organized around strong individual leadership that was earned and maintained through demonstrated ability. Some were more loosely confederated, with individual operators maintaining significant autonomy and coming together only for larger operations that required more hands. All of these structures had advantages and disadvantages that the lore explores through specific incidents and outcomes. Relations between raider communities and military-descended organizations were a source of sustained tension throughout the lore's timeline. The military organizations that survived the Arc disruptions were, in many cases, significantly changed from their pre-Arc forms, but they often retained hierarchical structures, weapons and equipment stockpiles, and access to technical resources that raider communities lacked. They also often had mandates, formal or informal, to exert authority over the areas in which they operated, and this brought them into conflict with raider communities that had developed their own norms of autonomy. The lore does not consistently portray either side of this tension as simply right or simply wrong. Military organizations sometimes provided genuine protection and resources that made community survival possible in difficult areas. They also sometimes used their leverage in ways that were exploitative or that prioritized organizational survival and expansion over the welfare of the communities they were supposedly protecting. The raider community's resistance to external authority was sometimes a genuine defense of earned autonomy, and sometimes a cover for practices that the communities themselves could not justify in the open. The question of what raiders were ultimately for, in the larger sense, was one that the lore presents as actively contested within raider communities themselves. The practical answer, survival supply, was clear, but survival supply for what purpose, toward what end, was not a question with an obvious answer, and the fragments suggest it was one that the more thoughtful members of these communities engaged with seriously. Some portions of the raider community, as described in the lore, understood themselves as existing in a fundamentally reactive mode, responding to conditions rather than working toward any positive vision of the future. This was not necessarily a cynical position. It could reflect a kind of realism about the constraints of the situation, an understanding that the margin for survival was small enough that spending energy on visionary thinking was a luxury that could not always be afforded. Other portions of the raider community maintained more explicitly forward-looking frameworks, though these varied enormously in content. Some looked toward eventual reclamation of the surface, a future in which Ark activity was ended or reduced enough that something resembling pre-Ark surface life was possible again. Some looked toward a more permanent adaptation, a human civilization that had fully integrated underground and subsurface living and no longer needed to reclaim the surface in the old sense. Some looked towards something more ambiguous, less a specific end state, and more a continued capacity to navigate whatever came next. These different orientations toward the future mattered when the crisis at Blue Gate emerged, because they shaped what different groups and individuals understood themselves to be fighting for. The difference between fighting to survive today and fighting to enable a specific future is not trivial. It affects what trade-offs you're willing to accept, what risks you're willing to take, and what you're willing to do to people on your own side, when your assessments of the situation differ from theirs. The Ark's presence over the years had created what the law describes as a kind of topography of risk on the surface. Not all areas were equally dangerous. Not all Ark activity was equally threatening to human operators. Raiders who knew their operational areas deeply had a picture of this topography that allowed them to navigate it, to some extent, rather than simply being subject to it. The development and maintenance of this picture was one of the central practical projects of raider culture, and one of the things that made experienced raiders genuinely valuable. Blue Gate, in this topography, occupied a specific position. The location had been characterized in the accumulated raider knowledge base as a high-significance, high-risk area. High significance because the Ark activity there was dense and the materials available were correspondingly valuable. High risk for the same reason. It was an area that most raider operators approached carefully and did not linger in. The kind of place where you went in with a specific objective, got what you needed, and got out, rather than a place where extended operations were practical. The change in that characterization, when it came, was therefore notable. Something about Blue Gate was shifting, and the raiders who tracked these things closely were among the first to notice. The nature of the shift was not immediately clear, but the indicators that something was different were accumulating in the months before the events that would eventually become the story of Blue Gate's final chapter. What was happening at Blue Gate and why would take time to understand. It would require information from multiple sources that were not all inclined to share with each other. It would require putting together pieces that individually seemed incomplete, but that, assembled correctly, pointed towards something that changed the entire frame of reference for everyone involved. The raiders who ended up at Blue Gate did not all go there for the same reason. Some of them did not fully understand why they were there until they were already in it. Some of them understood exactly why they were there and had made a specific choice to be. All of them carried with them the culture and history and psychology that raider life had built in them. And those things shaped every decision they made when the decisions started to matter. Before we get to those events, we need to understand the other major thread of the law that leads to Blue Gate. The thread that comes not from raider communities, but from the organizations that had been studying the Ark from the very beginning. Because what happened at Blue Gate was not just a raider story, it was a convergence. Chapter 3. The research organizations and what they knew, the scientific and research organizations that survived the Ark disruption and continued operating in some form, are among the most fascinating elements of the game's lore, and also among the most morally complex. The impulse to understand what was happening, to build systematic knowledge about the Ark rather than simply react to it, was both genuinely valuable and, the law suggests, frequently a source of decisions that were very difficult to justify from a human welfare perspective. The largest and most well-documented of these organizations in the law material is referred to in various fragments under different names, reflecting the reorganizations and rebranding that happened over the years, but which most of the law eventually settles on calling simply the Archive. The Archive was not originally a unified organization. It was an eventual consolidation of multiple smaller research efforts that had developed in parallel during the Grey Years and the period immediately following. The founding logic of the Archive, as described in its own internal documents, preserved in the law fragments, was that understanding the Ark was not just intellectually interesting, but strategically essential. If the Ark was operating according to an internal logic, and the evidence suggested it was, then mapping that logic was a prerequisite for any effective, long-term human response. You could not manage or counter something you did not understand. The collection and analysis of Ark-related data was therefore framed from the beginning as a survival priority, not a luxury. This framing was compelling, and it is reflected in the resources that the Archive was able to assemble over time. Major surviving communities and military organizations contributed to Archive operations because the argument that systematic Ark research was essential was genuinely persuasive. The Archive's technical capabilities grew significantly over its early years, drawing on a pool of scientific and analytical talent that included some of the most capable people still alive. The resource flows into the Archive also created obligations that gradually shaped the organization's priorities in ways that the law presents as sometimes problematic. When you are funded by multiple powerful organizations with their own interests, those interests begin to exert pressure on what questions you ask and how you answer them. The Archive's leadership is portrayed in the law as navigating this pressure with varying degrees of success and integrity over the years, with some periods in which the organization maintained real independence and other periods in which it was clearly operating in service of particular funders' agendas. The specific research programs of the Archive that matter most for the Bluegate story involve attempts to understand Ark infrastructure, both the surface components that raider communities interacted with and the deeper systems that those surface components connected to. The Archive's analysis of Ark physical structures over the years produced a model of Ark architecture that was sophisticated and, the law suggests, largely correct in its broad outlines, even if incomplete in its details. What the Archive's model suggested, at a level of abstraction that made it difficult to communicate to non-specialist audiences, was that Ark surface activity was organized around a series of node structures, points at which multiple Ark operational systems converged in ways that made them locally more complex and more significant than other surface areas. These nodes were not randomly distributed. They appeared to be positioned according to a spatial logic that the Archive's researchers spent years trying to decode. Bluegate, in the Archive's model, was one of the more significant of these node structures. The concentration of Ark activity there, which matched what raider topographical experience had noted independently, corresponded in the Archive's analysis to a structural convergence that they believed connected to deeper Ark systems in a way that most other surface node structures did not. What exactly that connection meant was a matter of sustained internal debate within the Archive, but the node's significance was not in question. The Archive's information about Bluegate was not widely shared, which is a detail worth noting. The organization had a practice grounded in legitimate security concerns, but also in the organizational desire to maintain information advantages, of classifying significant findings at levels that restricted distribution. The analysis of Blue Gate's structural significance was classified at a level that meant most of the people who might have found it immediately actionable, specifically the radar operators who worked in that area, did not have access to it. This information management practice was one of the more significant sources of friction between the archive and radar communities, and it comes up repeatedly in the lore fragments that deal with inter-organizational relationships. Raiders who were operating in high-significance ARC areas with incomplete information about why those areas were significant faced risks they could not fully assess. The archive had information that would have been directly relevant to their safety and decision-making. The archive chose, for various reasons that were internally justified but that looked different from the outside, not to share it. There is a specific incident described in the lore that illuminates this dynamic in a particularly concrete way. A radar team operating in an area that the archive's models suggested was on a trajectory towards significantly increased ARC activity, a trajectory that the archive had identified months before the incident, was lost when the predicted increase in ARC activity materialized. The archive had the information, the radar team did not. The connection between those two facts was, the lore suggests, understood within the archive but not externally acknowledged. The archive's internal culture is described in the fragments with a combination of genuine intellectual richness and institutional pathology that feels psychologically real. The people doing the research were, many of them, deeply committed to the work and to its potential importance. The institutional structures within which they were doing the work created incentives and pressures that did not always align with the values those individuals brought to the work. The result was an organization capable of both genuine excellence and genuine failure, sometimes simultaneously. One of the research threads that runs through the archive material and that connects directly to Blue Gate involved what the archive called anomalous ARC communication signatures, detected in the vicinity of certain node structures. The standard ARC units encountered by raiders and studied by earlier archive research did not communicate in ways that human detection systems could interpret. The anomalous signatures were different. They were structured differently, with patterns that archive analysts believed were meaningful in some way, but had not been decoded. Blue Gate was one of the locations where these anomalous signatures were strongest and most consistent. This was, in the archive's internal analysis, part of what elevated Blue Gate above other node structures in significance. The question of what the signatures meant, whether they were internal ARC communication, some form of processing output, or something else entirely, was actively being worked on in the period leading up to the events at Blue Gate. The archive was not the only research organisation in the lore, and the others matter for the Blue Gate story in specific ways. There were smaller, more specialised groups that had developed expertise in specific aspects of ARC study. There were organisations that had started from military intelligence routes and maintained a more operational orientation toward ARC research. And there were, according to the more fragmentary and harder to verify portions of the lore, some research efforts that had gone in directions that the mainstream of the surviving human community would have found troubling. These last are referred to in the lore with a circumspection that suggests either that the available information is genuinely incomplete, or that the people producing the lore fragments were being careful about how directly they described what they knew. The references cluster around the concept of attempted direct ARC interface, efforts to establish some form of direct connection or communication with ARC systems that went beyond passive observation and analysis. The motivations attributed to these efforts vary in the fragments, from genuine scientific inquiry to more instrumental goals that are not fully specified. Whether any of these interface attempts produced results, and if so, what kind, is one of the questions that the lore leaves most deliberately open. The fragments that come closest to addressing it are also the most damaged and incomplete in the lore collection, which may be meaningful or may simply reflect the difficulty of preserving documentation from the most dangerous and least officially sanctioned research activities. What can be said with more confidence is that the knowledge accumulated across all of these research efforts, mainstream and otherwise, created a picture of the Ark that was substantially more detailed and more disturbing by the time of the Bluegate events than it had been in the early post-Ark years. The picture included things that were difficult to share with communities and individuals who were not prepared for them, and the question of how and whether to share that information was one of the persistent tensions within and between research organisations. The specific information that matters for Bluegate, and that we will come back to in detail later, involves the archive's analysis of what the node structures were actually for. Not what they appeared to be doing on the surface, the extraction and collection activities that raiders observed directly, but what the lore describes as the deeper functional purpose that the node activity was in service of. The archive's working model for this deeper purpose, developed over years of analysis, was alarming enough that the organization's leadership classified it at the highest level they used. The reason it was alarming is something we will get to, but understanding that this information existed, that it was in the archive's possession, and that the archive was managing it according to its own risk assessments and institutional interests, is essential for understanding why the events at Bluegate unfolded the way they did. Multiple parties would eventually converge on Bluegate with different pieces of information, different agendas, and different levels of understanding of what they were actually dealing with. The archive's field operatives, distinct from its research staff, were a group that the lore depicts in interesting ways. These were people who moved between the archive's facilities and the outside world, gathering information, making contact with other organizations, occasionally running what can only be described as intelligence operations in areas of interest. The archive's leadership referred to these activities with the kind of bureaucratic euphemism that institutional cultures develop to make things that are uncomfortable sound more acceptable, but the lore is fairly clear about what was actually happening. One of the archive's field operatives, whose history appears in the lore in enough detail to constitute something like a character study, was involved in pre-Bluegate activities in the region around that location. This operative's reports, which survive in fragmentary form in the lore, show someone who was gathering information about both Ark activity and the various human groups operating in the area, and who was increasingly unsettled by what they were finding. Not because the Ark activity was dramatically different from what was expected, but because of something about the human activity in the area that the operative found difficult to characterize and harder to report through normal channels. The human organizations operating near Bluegate in the period leading up to the events, they were not all acting in alignment with the norms and agreements that nominally governed inter-organizational relations in the post-Ark world. There were groups pursuing agendas that they were not being transparent about. There were resources moving in directions that did not match stated purposes. There was, in the archive operative's assessment, a concentration of human interest and activity around Bluegate that was not fully explained by the publicly acknowledged reasons for that interest. This observation, that multiple parties were converging on Bluegate for reasons they were not fully disclosing, was itself significant. It suggested that information about Bluegate's importance had reached more actors than the archive's classification practices were supposed to have allowed. How that information had leaked, and to whom, was a question that the archive's internal security apparatus was working on in the months before the crisis. They did not fully answer it before the crisis made the question moot. The overlap between the raider world and the research organization world was, by this period, more extensive than either community fully acknowledged. Raiders provided materials that research organizations needed. Research organizations provided information, selectively, that made certain raider operations more viable. These relationships were real, and they mattered, and they also created channels through which information moved in ways that the organizations involved did not always intend. The informal networks of the surviving human world were both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability from an information security perspective. Understanding this informal information ecology is part of understanding how the events at Bluegate came together. No single party planned the convergence at Bluegate in advance. The convergence emerged from multiple parties pursuing their own interests in ways that brought them to the same location at the same time. What made Bluegate significant enough to draw that level of attention, and what the various parties found when they got there, is the heart of the story we are working toward. Before we get there, we need to add one more thread to our understanding. We need to understand the Ark itself a little better, not in the broadest structural sense, but in the specific ways that the lore describes it operating at and around Bluegate. Because the human drama at Bluegate was happening in and around something that was doing its own thing according to its own logic, and that thing was not indifferent to human presence in exactly the way it had been earlier. Something had changed. Chapter 4. The Ark's architecture and the node system. To understand what made Bluegate important, you need to understand the larger system that Bluegate was a part of. The Ark, as the game's lore presents it, was not a fleet of discrete vehicles. It was not an army in any conventional sense. The best analogy the lore offers, and it offers it carefully, through the mouths of researchers who are aware of the analogy's limitations, is an infrastructure. Thinking of the Ark as infrastructure, rather than as an army or a weapon, shifts the frame significantly. Infrastructure does not have enemies. Infrastructure does not plan attacks. Infrastructure operates to maintain and extend the systems it supports, and it responds to interference, not out of hostility, but out of functional necessity. This framing is not meant to make the Ark seem benign. The lore is clear that the Ark's presence was catastrophic for humanity. The point is to describe the nature of that catastrophe more accurately. The Ark infrastructure, as the lore describes it, extended from orbit to the deep surface and potentially below. The orbital components, the most visible elements in the early days of the Ark presence, were not the operational heart of the system. They were more like interface points, connections between whatever the Ark was doing in deep space and whatever it was doing on the surface. The surface components were where the actual work happened. The collection, the processing, the whatever comes next that the lore is more cryptic about. The node structures, including Bluegate, were points in the surface architecture where multiple Ark operational functions converged. The archives model, which we discussed in the previous chapter, suggested that node structures served as coordination points for surrounding Ark activity, integrating the outputs of collection operations across a large surrounding area and processing them in ways that were more complex than what individual collection units could do on their own. If that model was correct, then attacking or disrupting a node structure would affect Ark operations across a much larger area than just the immediate location. This was the operational logic behind various human attempts to target node structures over the years, and the lore records some of these attempts with the kind of detail that lets you understand both why they were tried and why they mostly did not achieve their intended outcomes. The specific challenge with node structures as targets was that they were not fragile in the way that conventional infrastructure can be fragile. The Ark architecture appeared to have substantial redundancy built in, such that disrupting one node affected the system but did not break it. The system rerouted, adapted, and eventually re-established something functionally similar to what had been disrupted. This adaptability was one of the things that made the Ark so difficult to meaningfully counter through conventional attack. Bluegate was unusual among node structures in a way that the archive's analysis had identified but not fully explained. The redundancy that characterized other node structures seemed, in Bluegate's case, to be reduced or modified in a specific way. The archive's model suggested that Bluegate occupied a position in the Arc network's hierarchy that was different from other surface nodes. Not a standard coordination point, but something that the researchers described, carefully and with extensive caveats, as a transition point. A transition point in the archive's terminology referred to a node that connected the surface-level architecture to the deeper systems referenced earlier. Not just a more complex version of what standard nodes did, but a qualitatively different function, a point at which the surface operations fed into something below that was operating on a different scale and at a different level of the overall Arc infrastructure. The implications of this, if the model was correct, were significant and disturbing. Disrupting Bluegate would not simply affect Arc collection operations in a surrounding area. It might, depending on the nature and extent of the connection to the deeper systems, affect the Arc infrastructure at a level that was genuinely structural rather than merely operational. The archive's researchers were divided on how confident to be in this assessment, because the evidence for the deeper system connections was less direct than the evidence for the surface architecture, and the potential consequences of being wrong were severe in either direction. Being wrong in one direction meant treating Bluegate as more significant than it was, investing resources and accepting risks in pursuit of a disruption that turned out to be only as impactful as any other node disruption. That was a costly error, but a recoverable one. Being wrong in the other direction meant treating Bluegate as less significant than it was, failing to act on an opportunity when the opportunity presented itself, and potentially triggering a response from the deeper Arc systems that human communities were not prepared for. The archive's internal debate about this was, according to the fragments, genuinely agonized. The people involved understood the weight of the decision they were trying to make and did not take it lightly. But the institutional dynamics of the archive, the pressure from funders with different interests, the classification practices that limited who was part of the conversation, and the simple difficulty of making high-stakes decisions under deep uncertainty meant that the debate did not resolve cleanly. The Arc's activity at Bluegate in the period leading up to the events, there had been changing in ways that multiple sources noted independently. Radar operators in the area observed modifications to the node's surface architecture, structures being added or reconfigured in ways that did not match previous patterns. Archive instruments monitoring the node remotely detected changes in the anomalous communication signatures that had been identified as distinctive to Bluegate. Changes that analysts described as showing increased complexity and frequency. What these changes meant was not fully understood, but the most prominent interpretation within the archive was that Bluegate was entering some kind of operational phase transition. The node was doing something different from what it had been doing before, or more accurately, it was doing the same things, but at a different intensity, and toward what appeared to be a different end state. The archive's urgency about understanding Bluegate increased significantly once this interpretation became the dominant view. The communication signatures are worth discussing in more specific terms because they matter for what happened at Bluegate. The signatures were not radio signals in the conventional sense. They did not correspond to any encoding standard that archive analysts could map onto known communication formats. What they had in common with communication, from the analyst perspective, was structure. They were structured in ways that appeared non-random, and the structure appeared to carry meaning in some sense, even if that meaning was not decoded. One of the more intriguing and contested elements of the archive's Bluegate research involved what some analysts described as responsiveness in the communication signatures. The suggestion was that the signatures were not simply output from Arc systems, but were in some sense interactive, that they responded to specific types of input in ways that suggested the system generating them was not simply broadcasting, but was also in some sense listening. This interpretation was contested because the evidence for it was indirect and the alternative explanations were not ruled out. But it was taken seriously enough to shape how some of the archive's most senior researchers thought about what Blue Gate was. If Blue Gate was listening, the next question was what it was listening for. And if some of the murkier lore fragments are read together, the answer that emerges is not reassuring. The signatures seemed most active, most complex, during periods of significant human activity in the vicinity of the node. Not arc activity, human activity. The correlation was not perfect and the causal direction was not established, but it was noted, and it was one of the data points that fed into the most alarming interpretation of what Blue Gate might be. The most alarming interpretation set out in a classified archive document that is referenced in several lore fragments, but from which only partial quotes survive, was that Blue Gate's function, at least in part, involved monitoring and assessing human populations and human behaviour in its surrounding area. Not for the purpose of immediate response, because the Ark's behaviour in the area remained the same indifferent pattern that characterised Ark behaviour generally, but as part of a longer-term assessment that was feeding into the deeper systems and ultimately into whatever the Ark's overall goals were. If that interpretation was correct, then Blue Gate was not just an operational node. It was, in some sense, an evaluation point, a place where data about humanity was being collected and processed and sent upward through the Ark hierarchy. What the Ark was evaluating humanity for, and what the evaluation results might eventually trigger, was the question that the archive's most senior researchers were sitting with in the period just before Blue Gate became a crisis rather than a research priority. The node's physical architecture at Blue Gate, described in the lore through both remote observation records and the accounts of raiders who had gotten close to it, was impressive in a way that was qualitatively different from other Ark structures. Where most Ark surface installations had a functional, even minimal quality, as if they were built to serve a purpose rather than to make an impression, Blue Gate's node structure had elements that did not fit that description. There was a scale and a complexity to the physical form that went beyond what the visible operational functions seemed to require. Raiders who had approached closely enough to observe details reported features of the structure that did not correspond to any Ark component type in the accumulated knowledge base. Some of these features were architectural in the broadest sense, structural arrangements that served no obvious purpose from a purely functional standpoint. Others were closer to what a human observer might describe as marking or signalling, patterns and configurations that appeared to be communicating something rather than doing something in a mechanical sense. The archive's analysts had noted these features and had, over the years, produced multiple interpretive frameworks for understanding them. None of these frameworks had achieved consensus. The features remained in the archive's internal classification as Class 3 unknowns, things observed and documented but not explained, waiting for a context that would make their meaning clear. Whether that context ever became clear and what it revealed is part of what the events at Blue Gate were about. The node was not simply a piece of infrastructure, it was also, the lore strongly suggests, a document of some kind, a record of something the Ark had done, or was doing, or intended to do. Reading that document, to the extent that reading it was possible, was one of the things that the human parties converging on Blue Gate were, explicitly or implicitly, hoping to do. The Ark's behaviour in the immediate vicinity of Blue Gate had a quality the lore describes in different ways, in different sources, but that consistently points towards something that human observers found difficult to categorise. The Ark units active near Blue Gate were not behaving like the collection units, or the defensive units, or any of the other categorised Ark types. Their behaviour was different in ways that were specific to the location, rather than to any mechanical type, suggesting that the location itself was shaping what the units present there were doing. This location-specific behavior was another data point feeding the interpretation that Blue Gate was a special site in the Ark infrastructure, something different from other nodes rather than just a larger or more complex version of them. But it was also a practical challenge for anyone trying to operate near Blue Gate, because the existing Ark behavior models that raiders and military operators used to inform their risk assessments were built on the categorized type behavior and were therefore less applicable at Blue Gate than elsewhere. Operating near Blue Gate therefore required accepting a higher degree of behavioral uncertainty than most other Ark proximate operations, even given the generally high uncertainty of surface work. This was known and accepted by the people who chose to go there, but knowing and accepting a risk is not the same as knowing how to manage it. The specific ways that Blue Gate's local Ark environment would challenge the people who eventually converged, they could not be fully anticipated, because the information required to anticipate them was not available. This is the arc, if you will, of the technical context we need before moving into the human events. Blue Gate was significant in the Ark architecture at a level that most parties outside the archive's inner research circles did not fully understand. It was changing in ways that suggested something important was approaching. It was located in an environment that was more operationally unpredictable than most. And multiple human parties were converging on it, each with their own information, their own interests, and their own understanding of what was at stake. We have one more major element to add to this picture before we can begin moving through the events themselves. We need to understand the specific human parties that converged at Blue Gate and what they were each bringing to the encounter. Chapter 5. The Factions and Their Agendas. The lore of Ark Raiders does not present a simple binary between good and bad factions. The parties that eventually converged at Blue Gate were each, from their own perspective, pursuing goals that they understood as legitimate and important. Understanding those goals and the reasoning behind them is essential for understanding why the events at Blue Gate unfolded as they did, and why the outcomes were as complicated as they were. The first faction to discuss is the archive itself, or more precisely, the specific archive operational unit that was active in the Blue Gate region. The archive's agenda at Blue Gate was, on its surface, primarily investigative. They wanted to understand what the node was doing and whether the phase transition interpretation was correct. But investigation was not the whole of it. The archive's more senior leadership had authorized, at some level, above what the field personnel were explicitly told, a contingency planning process for the possibility of interfering with Blue Gate's operations. That contingency planning is important because it means the archive was present in the Blue Gate region not just as observers, but as potential actors. The field personnel may not have fully understood this. The documentation suggests that the information about the archive's potential interference agenda was held at a level above what was shared with the people actually in the field, a management practice that created significant problems when things started moving faster than the decision-making structure could accommodate. The second major human faction at Blue Gate was what the law refers to as the Coalition, a loose alliance of larger settlement communities and the military organizations affiliated with them that had formed over the previous decade for the explicit purpose of coordinating human response to Ark activity. The Coalition was the closest thing to an organized human authority in the game's world at this period, and it was deeply imperfect in ways the law does not obscure. The Coalition's agenda at Blue Gate was more explicitly operational than the archives. The Coalition had developed its own analysis of Blue Gate's significance, drawing on both publicly available raider intelligence and information that it had obtained from the archive through various channels, some authorized and some not. Their analysis had reached some of the same conclusions as the archive's internal work, but with different emphasis, prioritizing the question of whether Blue Gate could be disrupted in a way that significantly impaired Ark operations in the region. The coalition's interest in disruption was strategic in the conventional military sense. If Blue Gate was a critical node, taking it out would have immediate operational benefits. The deeper significance of the node, the possibility that it was connected to systems at a level above surface operations, was acknowledged in coalition planning documents, but was given less weight than the archive's researchers would have given it. The coalition planners were, understandably, focused on the war they could see, rather than the war they could only model. The third faction was the raider community, but not as a unified body, because raider communities were not unified. The specific raider groups at Blue Gate represented at least 3 distinct organizations, with different histories, different relationships to the coalition and the archive, and different assessments of what was happening and what should be done about it. What they shared was operational presence in the area and a practical interest in what happened at Blue Gate that was less ideological and more immediate than the larger organization's interests. Among the raider factions at Blue Gate, the lore presents one group as having more information than the others, specifically information obtained through the informal networks that connected raider communities to research organizations. This group had, through relationships that are described with some deliberate vagueness in the lore, obtained pieces of the archive's Blue Gate analysis that were technically classified. They did not have the full picture, but they had enough to understand that Blue Gate was something different from what the public description of it suggested. This partial knowledge was, the lore suggests, more dangerous in some ways than either complete knowledge or complete ignorance. The group had enough information to make them highly motivated to be present and active at Blue Gate, but not enough information to fully calibrate the risks of what they were planning to do there. Their operational decisions in the event would be shaped by this gap in ways that had significant consequences. The fourth human faction at Blue Gate is the most difficult to describe clearly because the lore's information about them is deliberately incomplete. This group, referred to in various fragments under different names, appears to have been connected to some of the more extreme Ark research efforts referenced in the previous chapter, the ones involving attempted direct Ark interface. Their presence at Blue Gate was not publicly acknowledged and was not apparently sanctioned by any of the mainstream human organizations. What this faction was actually planning to do at Blue Gate is one of the genuine mysteries of the lore, because the fragments that describe their activities are among the most damaged and the most obviously incomplete in the available record. What can be inferred from the surviving material is that they had their own understanding of Blue Gate's significance, an understanding that diverged from both the archives and the coalitions in ways that shaped a radically different set of intentions. The possibility that the lore raises, carefully, and with the appropriate use of hedging language, is that this faction believed they could use Blue Gate to establish something like a controlled interface with the deeper Ark systems that the node connected to, not in the sense of a conventional communication attempt, but something more direct, more technical, and more dangerous. Whether they had a sound basis for believing this was possible, and what they thought the outcome would be if it was, are questions the lore leaves more open than they probably need to be for the story to make sense. The fifth element in the human configuration at Blue Gate was not a faction in the organized sense, but a collection of individuals who had made their way there for reasons that were personal rather than institutional. The lore acknowledges these individuals without fully developing all of their backstories, but their presence is narratively important because they represent the human reality of the situation in ways that the faction descriptions tend to abstract away from. Among these individuals were people who had lost family members in Ark incidents near Blue Gate, people who had been carrying specific information about the location and had spent years trying to find an opportunity to act on it. people who had been sent by smaller communities too isolated and too poorly resourced to be part of any of the major factions, but with interests in the outcome of Blue Gate events that were no less real for being less organized. These individuals, operating between the factions, and sometimes with relationships to more than one of them, would turn out to matter in ways that none of the faction planners had accounted for. The inter-faction dynamics among the human parties at Blue Gate were complicated before they got to the location, and became much more complicated once they were there. The Coalition and the Archive had an official relationship that was supposed to involve information sharing and coordinated action, and this relationship was real enough to have produced some genuine cooperation over the years, but it was also strained by the Archive's information management practices and the Coalition's tendency to prioritize military utility over research quality. Both organizations knew these strains existed. Neither had fully addressed them. The Raider faction's relationships with both the Coalition and the Archive were defined by a mixture of practical dependence and deep mistrust. Raiders needed the larger organizations for certain resources and protections that they could not provide for themselves. The larger organizations needed Raider operational capacity and knowledge in areas where they had no other reliable access. These mutual dependencies kept the relationships functional, but they did not create genuine alignment, and the histories of grievances on both sides were not forgotten. The Archive's relationship with the fourth faction, the one pursuing the unauthorized interface work, was officially non-existent. The Archive did not acknowledge this faction's existence in any official communications, and the Archive's leadership maintained, apparently with genuine sincerity in some cases, and less genuine sincerity in others, that they had no knowledge of or connection to the activities in question. The reality, as the law suggests through multiple oblique references, was more complicated. What the law seems to indicate is that the fourth faction included, or had included at various points, individuals who had started their careers within the Archive or in organizations closely connected to it. Whether the Archive's leadership had any ongoing knowledge of or communication with this faction by the time of the Blue Gate events is not cleanly resolved, but the history of connections was real, and it mattered for how the events played out. The Coalition's internal dynamics added another layer of complexity to the Blue Gate situation. The Coalition was not a unified command with a single chain of authority. It was an alliance of entities with their own interests, and those interests were not always aligned. The specific forces that the Coalition deployed to Blue Gate were operating under commands that reflected compromises between different Coalition members' priorities, and those compromises had shaped a mission structure that, in retrospect, was not ideally designed for the environment it was entering. Military doctrine, to the extent that surviving human military organizations maintained coherent doctrine, had been adapted significantly from pre-arc frameworks, but still carried assumptions that had been shaped by conventional conflict. The specific challenges of operating in a high-arc activity environment like Blue Gate pushed the boundaries of those adapted frameworks in ways that the Coalition planners had not fully accounted for. The people they were sending were trained and capable, but they were trained and capable for a version of the Blue Gate environment that turned out to be less accurate than it should have been. The Raider faction's operational planning for Blue Gate, while less formally structured than the Coalition's, was in some ways better adapted to the actual conditions. Raider operational culture was built around the principle that your plan was a starting point rather than a blueprint, and that the ability to adapt to conditions that differed from your planning assumptions was a core operational skill. This adaptability, built through years of surface experience, would turn out to matter enormously in what was coming. The fourth faction's operational planning is the least documented and the hardest to analyze, but the fragments available suggest a level of preparation that was surprisingly thorough given the unofficial nature of their presence. They had equipment that indicated advanced knowledge of the specific challenges of Blue Gate's environment. They had a timeline that positioned them at the location at a specific point in the phase transition process that the Ark activity there was undergoing, and they had a plan, however incompletely described in the surviving lore, that was clearly not the same plan as any of the other parties. The accumulation of human parties at Blue Gate, each with their own agenda and their own information and their own capabilities and limitations, created a situation with a high degree of inherent volatility. Even without any of the specific events that followed, the configuration was unstable. Multiple parties with competing interests in the same location, operating with incomplete information about each other's intentions and incomplete information about the environment they were in, was a situation that required a great deal of things to go right in order to avoid going very wrong. Some of those things went right, many of them did not. What happened next and why requires us to move from the contextual and the structural to the specific and the sequential. We need to follow the timeline of events at Blue Gate in the order they happened, with the understanding of the context we have built, to see how everything we have discussed converged in a specific place at a specific time and produced outcomes that changed the shape of the world that came after. Chapter 6. The Road to Blue Gate begins. The first indication in the lore that something significantly different was beginning to happen at Blue Gate came through radar operational channels. A small team working the region around the node, conducting what was described in their reporting as routine survey operations, documented a change in the surface architecture of the node that did not match any previous documentation. The change was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing you would notice only if you'd been watching closely for a long time and had a good baseline to compare against. What the team documented was the appearance of what they described as new connective structures at the base of the primary node formation. These were physical elements, material extensions of the node's architecture, reaching outward from the node's existing footprint in directions that had previously been clear surface. The extensions were small initially. The team measured them and noted they appeared to be growing at a rate that was slow by human construction standards, but consistent and directed. The significance of growing arc structures is something that the radar knowledge base had information about. Arc structures did not typically grow. They were placed or they were not. The idea that an existing node structure was extending itself outward was unusual enough to merit immediate reporting rather than holding for the next scheduled communication window. The team transmitted its documentation to their home community, which transmitted it onward through the network that connected radar communities in the region. That transmission reached, among other places, a community that had an existing information-sharing relationship with a specific archive field station. The field station's operator, recognizing the description, cross-referenced it against the baseline data they had on Blue Gate and confirmed that what the radar team had documented was not previously observed. They flagged it at the highest priority in their internal reporting system and transmitted it to the Archive's Regional Analysis Center. The Archive's Analysis Center had been waiting for something like this, though they had not been specific about what form it would take. The phase transition hypothesis, which had been the dominant internal framework for Blue Gate for the previous year, had included predictions about surface architecture changes that would accompany the transition. The growing connective structures matched those predictions closely enough to shift the hypothesis from speculative to likely in the internal assessment. The Archive's response to this assessment was to escalate the priority of Blue Gate operations across the board. Field personnel whose attention had been divided between Blue Gate and other sites in the region were directed to focus on Blue Gate. Analysis resources that had been processing other data were redirected, and the classified contingency planning process that we mentioned earlier began moving from planning to implementation. That escalation was not entirely contained within the archive's own systems. Information about significant changes in ARC activity at major locations had a tendency to move through the informal networks of the post-ARC world faster than any official channel, because the people in those networks understood the practical importance of such information and treated its transmission as a priority. Within the same communication cycle that saw the archive's internal escalation, versions of the information were moving through raider networks, reaching coalition intelligence channels, and by routes that are not fully documented, reaching the fourth faction as well. Each party received a different version of the information, shaped by the specific sources and networks they were connected to. The archive got the most complete version, filtered through their own analytical frameworks. The coalition got a version that had passed through raider operational channels and lost some technical specificity, but retained the key point about architecture change. The raider factions got versions that varied in completeness depending on their specific network connections. And the fourth faction got, it appears, something that was in some ways more specific than what any of the other parties received, which raises questions about the sources of their information that the law does not cleanly answer. The coalition's response to the information it received was to accelerate a planning process that had already been underway. The coalition had been considering a Blue Gate operation for some months, contingent on the right combination of circumstances. The architecture change information was interpreted as indicating that those circumstances were arriving sooner than expected. Coalition military leadership convened an emergency planning session and began issuing preparatory orders to the forces they intended to deploy. Those forces, as noted earlier, were not ideally configured for what they were actually going to encounter. The planning session was working against time pressure and with information that was good but not complete. The mission structure that emerged from it was workable but not optimal, a product of the compromises required to get agreement among the coalition members' representatives in the time available. People who were going to Blue Gate were given objectives and were not given enough context to fully understand why those objectives mattered or what the broader picture looked like. The raider faction's response to the information varied by faction. The group with partial archive information began moving toward the region with the urgency of people who understood they were on a schedule. The other raider groups moved with more caution, trying to assess the developing situation before committing fully. All of them recognized that something significant was happening and that their presence in the area was warranted. In the days following the initial documentation of the architecture change, the pace of change at Blue Gate accelerated. The connective structures continued growing. New features appeared on the node's upper architecture that had not been present before. The anomalous communication signatures intensified to levels that the archive's monitoring systems had not previously recorded. The ARC units in the vicinity of the node increased in number and changed in behavioral pattern in ways that were consistent with the location-specific behavior observed previously but amplified. The archive field personnel who were monitoring this escalation were sending reports that carried a quality of controlled urgency. The people writing them were professionals trying to maintain analytical discipline, but the things they were documenting were beyond the ordinary parameters of their experience, and this was visible in the texture of the reports if you read them carefully. Phrasing choices that revealed heightened alertness. Frequency of reporting that exceeded normal protocols. Questions asked in reports that were not typical questions. Questions that suggested the reporters were uncertain about the interpretive frameworks they had been given. One specific report from an archive field operative in the Blue Gate region, referenced in several lore fragments, is notable for a passage that describes a visual observation of the node structure that the operative found difficult to categorize. The structure, which had previously had the functional, purposive quality characteristic of ARC architecture generally, had developed something that the operative described, with explicit uncertainty about the accuracy of the description, as intent. They were careful to note that this was not a technical observation, and that they were not claiming to understand what they were seeing. They were reporting what their perception was, filtered through their training, and their perception was that something about the structure had changed in a way that felt qualitative rather than merely quantitative. This kind of language in an otherwise technically disciplined report is significant for what it suggests about the experience of being present at Bluegate during this period. The changes were not just measurable, they were perceptible in ways that went beyond measurement, ways that the people present found themselves reaching for non-technical language to describe. The law treats this as meaningful and not as a failure of analytical rigor. Something was different about Bluegate, and it was different in ways that human perception was picking up on before the analysis could fully characterize it. The coalition forces moving toward the Bluegate region were briefed on their approach. The briefing they received emphasized the operational objectives and the known ARC activity parameters. It mentioned the architecture changes. It did not mention the archive's phase transition hypothesis in full, because that information was classified at a level that the coalition members who had sanctioned the operation had not fully accessed. The forces heading to Bluegate were therefore operating with an objective that made sense in terms of what they knew, but that did not capture the full significance of what they were heading toward. This is one of the recurring themes of the Bluegate story, and it is worth naming clearly. Multiple parties were moving toward a significant event with incomplete information, and the specific ways their information was incomplete were shaped by the classification and information management practices of the major organizations involved. The people who were going to be doing the most dangerous things in the most dangerous environment had the least complete picture of what they were actually dealing with. The fourth faction was in position before any of the other parties, based on what the law suggests about their timeline. They had moved into the Bluegate region under cover of normal raider traffic, their operational signatures indistinguishable from standard raider activity to anyone who was not looking very specifically for them. Their presence was not detected by the archive's monitoring systems or by the coalition's intelligence apparatus before the event began. How they managed this, given the level of surveillance the major organizations were maintaining in the region, is another of the questions the law leaves incompletely answered. The archive field personnel reached the immediate vicinity of Bluegate in the period just before the coalition forces arrived. They had made camp in a position that gave them observation of the node while maintaining sufficient distance to be outside the most active ARC unit patrol patterns. Their equipment included the archive's most advanced monitoring instruments, some of which had been deployed at Bluegate previously, and some of which were being used in this location for the first time. What the archive's monitoring instruments were showing in the hours before the other parties arrived was consistent with, but exceeding all previous baseline readings. The communication signatures had continued to intensify and had developed new structural features that the analysts were working to characterize in real time. The connective structures on the node's surface had extended further and had begun to show what appeared to be active material deposition at their growing ends. The first direct evidence that the growth was an ongoing process rather than a static change that had already completed. The archive's senior analyst on site, according to the fragments, sent a high-priority transmission to the archive's regional leadership, requesting updated guidance on the contingency authorization. The response came back with language that was technically an authorization, but that was crafted in the kind of bureaucratic formulation that provides authorization without providing clear direction, leaving the field personnel with the authority to act but without the clarity about when and how to act that would have made that authority useful. This transmission exchange, brief as it was, captures something important about the institutional dynamics that shaped the Blue Gate events. The people with the authority to make decisions were not in the field. The people in the field had authority that was ambiguous in its scope. When things move faster than anyone expected, the gap between field reality and institutional decision-making would matter in ways that could not be corrected. The coalition forces arrived at the outer perimeter of the Blue Gate area in the late hours of what the law treats as a specific but unnamed day. Their arrival was observed by the archive's field personnel, who identified them correctly as coalition and made contact through an established inter-organizational channel. The contact established basic coordination, sharing of position information, and an agreement in principle to communicate significant developments. It did not establish unified command or shared operational authority because neither organization was prepared to subordinate itself to the other. The raider factions arrived through different routes and at different times. The group with partial archive information came in from a direction that suggested they had advanced knowledge of ARC unit patrol patterns specific to the current period, knowledge that the other parties did not have, and that raised questions in the archive's field personnel's mind about where it had come from. The other raider groups came in through more conventional raider approach routes, with the competence of people who knew this environment, but also with the heightened alertness of people who could see that something was different. What none of the arriving parties had full situational awareness of was each other's complete intentions, or the presence of the fourth faction. The configuration that was assembling at Blue Gate was more complex, more volatile, and more consequential than any individual party's planning had accounted for. And the ARC, meanwhile, was continuing to do what it had been doing, indifferent to the human activity assembling around it, except that the communication signatures the archive's monitoring systems were showing had begun to include something new, something that the archive's lead analyst, reviewing the data in real time, described in their field notes as a query, not a human communication, not anything that made immediate sense in human terms, but something structured in a way that suggested the system generating it was in some sense asking a question. What question it was asking, and whether anything in the human assembly at Blue Gate was going to be able to answer it, would not become clear for some time. But it is worth noting, at this point in the story, that the ARC was not simply continuing its previous activity while humans assembled around it. Something at Blue Gate was changing, and some part of that change may have been a response to the humans who were coming. Chapter 7. First contact at the gates. The night before the events that would define Blue Gate's place in the law began with something quiet. The archive's monitoring stations, positioned in a ring around the immediate node area, were returning data that analysts described in real-time logs as unprecedented in scope, but not yet unprecedented in kind. The communication signatures had reached a density and complexity that exceeded all previous records for the site, but they were still recognizably extensions of the signature types that had been observed there for years. Something was being turned up, not something entirely new. The coalition forces had established a perimeter at a distance from the node that their planning had designated as a safe operating radius based on previous ARC behavioral data for the location. The commanders who had established that perimeter did not yet know that ARC behavior at Blue Gate in the current phase was not the behavior their safety radius was calculated for. They were operating on models that were accurate for a Blue Gate that no longer existed. The archive's field personnel were aware of this discrepancy because their instruments were showing activity patterns at the edge of the coalition's perimeter that suggested the effective operational zone of the node's ARC unit activity had expanded beyond previous parameters. They transmitted this information to the coalition liaison using the channel established on arrival. The transmission was received and acknowledged. Whether the information it contained was acted on was not confirmed before other events began. The raider group with partial archive information had positioned themselves in a way that, in retrospect, suggests they were not treating the coalition force's perimeter as defining their own operational boundaries. They were inside it, at a position between the coalition perimeter and the node, in an area that the coalition forces had designated as a restricted zone. How they had gotten there without being detected by coalition sensors, or whether they had been detected and the detection had not been communicated to anyone who acted on it, is one of the more practically interesting questions the law raises without fully answering. The fourth faction, whose position was unknown to all other parties, was inside the restricted zone as well, and closer to the node than the raider group. The lack of any prior detection of their presence was significant. Either their operational security was genuinely exceptional, which the law does not fully discount, or there was some more specific explanation for why the major organization's surveillance systems had not picked them up. The event that began the active phase of Bluegate started not with any human action, but with a change in ARC behavior at the node. The units that had been patrolling the area around the node in the specific pattern and characteristic of the current period stopped their patrol movement simultaneously. Across the area monitored by the archive's instruments, ARC units that had been in motion stopped. The effect was striking in the monitoring data, not an escalation, but a cessation, a sudden quiet in a system that had been in continuous motion. The archive's analysts did not have immediate consensus on what this meant. The interpretations offered in the real-time notes ranged from the possibility that the units had received instructions that put them in a holding pattern to the much more alarming possibility that the cessation was a prelude to a significant change in operational mode. The latter interpretation was the one that the lead analyst eventually weighted most heavily, and they transmitted it with urgency to all parties they were in contact with. The transmission reached the coalition liaison and the raider network connections. It did not, obviously, reach the fourth faction, whose communications were not accessible. And the timing of the transmission relative to the next development was tight enough that the parties receiving it had very little time to act on it. What happened next at the node was something that the monitoring data captured and that multiple field observers recorded visually. The node's primary structure, the central formation that had been the constant architectural feature of Bluegate since long before the current period, began to emit light. Not the functional illumination associated with ARC operational activity, which had been observed before. This was something different in character, a deep, structured luminescence that originated from within the architecture rather than from external ARC or plasma sources. The light had pattern to it. That is what the observers uniformly noted. It was not uniform or diffuse. It moved through the architecture in ways that were structured and repeated, but that did not correspond to any ARC activity type in the catalogued record. The archive's optical analysis instruments, running continuously, began generating data that the analysts would later describe as the richest and most coherent dataset ever captured from ARC infrastructure, richer than anything the instruments had been designed to capture. The coalition forces' reaction to the light event was what their training prepared them for, which was treating a significant change in ARC activity as a potential precursor to hostile action and preparing to respond to hostile action. The commands moving through the coalition units were defensive in intent, positioning for response rather than initiating anything. But positioning for response meant movement, and movement in ARC proximate environments was a variable that was not always controllable in its effects. The ARC units that had stopped moving did not resume movement in response to coalition repositioning. They remained in place, which was itself unusual, because the standard behavioral model for ARC units, when human movement was detected in proximity, was to respond in one of several ways that had been catalogued. Remaining completely stationary was not the standard response. The analysts registered this as significant additional data without having an immediate interpretation for it. Inside the restricted zone, closer to the node, the experience of the light event was qualitatively different from what the outer perimeter observers were seeing. The radar group in the inner zone described, in fragments that survive in the law record, a sense that the light was not simply emitted but was directed, that it was not illuminating the surrounding area indiscriminately, but was moving across the landscape with something that felt, to the people present, like attention. Whether that perception was accurate or was a product of the unusual visual stimulus combined with the elevated stress of the situation is not established, but it was shared across multiple observers in the inner zone, which makes it harder to dismiss as purely individual perception. Something about the light at Blue Gate, in the experience of the people closest to it, had a quality that they described with words that implied directed awareness. The communication signatures that the archive's instruments were monitoring had, during the light event, transformed in ways that the monitoring systems struggled to process in real time. The new structural features that had begun appearing in the signatures earlier had expanded and accelerated, and they had developed in ways that the analysts could not immediately map onto any existing analytical framework. They were not extensions of known signature types. They were something different, something that suggested the system generating them was operating in a mode it had not operated in before. The archive's lead analyst, at this point in the event, made a decision that the law treats as significant. They transmitted a specific piece of the archive's classified analysis to all parties in the area, using an emergency broadcast protocol that bypassed the normal classification enforcement systems. The piece they transmitted was the section of the analysis dealing with the interpretation of Blue Gate as a transition point and the implications of the transition completing. They included it without authorization from the archive's leadership, making a judgment call that the people in the field needed this information more than the classification restrictions needed to be maintained. The transmission reached coalition commanders who read it with a mixture of recognition, because it confirmed some of what they had been working from, and alarm, because it filled in the parts of the picture they had not had. It reached the radar groups, including the one inside the restricted zone, and by the transmission going out on the emergency broadcast channel, it almost certainly reached the fourth faction as well, though their response to it was not observable from outside. The archive's leadership, on receiving notification that the emergency broadcast had gone out, began making communications of their own, including what sounds, from the fragments available, like a very urgent conversation with whatever decision-making body in the coalition had sanctioned the operation. These communications were happening above the level of the field personnel, and their contents are not fully preserved in the available law, but their consequences would eventually shape what options the field personnel had. The coalition commanders processing the archive's classification-breaking transmission updated their operational assessments in real time. The updated assessment was not good in the sense of being reassuring. It was clarifying, which was different. They now understood more about why they were there and what disrupting the node might or might not accomplish. And they also now understood that what was happening at the node was not simply an escalation of existing activity, but a qualitative transition to a different operational mode, one for which their current mission structure had not planned. The decisions that came out of that updated assessment, and the ones made simultaneously by the raider groups and the fourth faction, and the decisions that the Ark itself seemed to be making at Blue Gate, all came together in the following hours, in ways that neither planning nor precedent had fully prepared anyone for. We are now at the point in the story where everything that has been building starts to move. Chapter 8. The battle begins. The first direct engagement at Blue Gate was not initiated by the coalition forces, and was not initiated by any of the raider groups. The first engagement was initiated by the fourth faction, and it happened at a moment that, the law suggests, was deliberate rather than opportunistic. They had been waiting for the light event, and for the transformation of the communication signatures that accompanied it. The specific moment of the light event's peak intensity was the moment they'd been timing toward. What the fourth faction did at that moment was not an attack in the conventional sense. The law describes it in terms that point toward an attempted interface with the node systems at the physical level, using equipment that had been developed, apparently over years, for precisely this purpose. The equipment was sophisticated enough that the archive's field personnel, when they detected its use, recognized it as something beyond ordinary radar or military technology and inferred correctly that the people using it had access to Ark-derived technical knowledge that was not publicly available. The attempt generated a response from the Ark that was also not in the standard behavioral catalogue. The Ark units that had been stationary began moving again, but not in the defensive patterns associated with threat response. They moved toward the fourth faction's position with a speed and coordination that suggested directed purpose rather than automatic defensive response. The distinction mattered because the defensive response pattern was one that the radar operational experience had ways of working around. The directed purpose movement was different and faster. The coalition forces, observing the Ark unit movement, acted on their defensive preparations and engaged the Ark units that were moving through their perimeter. This was within their training parameters and their standing orders. The engagement was tactically competent. The coalition forces were trained for this. They understood Ark unit vulnerabilities at the type level, and they applied that knowledge effectively. But the Ark units they were engaging were not behaving according to the type level model. The increased operational complexity of Blue Gate's local Ark environment, noted in the pre-event analysis, was fully apparent now. The units were more responsive, more adaptive in their tactical behavior than the operational models predicted. The coalition forces' engagement was effective, but it cost more than it should have given the forces applied. The raider group inside the restricted zone, who had the best ground-level view of the unfolding situation, had a decision to make immediately. They could attempt to extract from their current position, which was now in the middle of an active engagement zone. They could attempt to reach the fourth faction's position, potentially with the goal of either assisting or preventing what the fourth faction was doing, depending on their interpretation of the situation, or they could do something else entirely. The decision they made was informed by the partial archive information they had been carrying. That information, now supplemented by the archive's emergency transmission, gave them a framework for understanding what the fourth faction's attempted interface meant and what the risks were if it succeeded or failed. The raider group moved not toward the fourth faction's position and not toward extraction, but toward the node itself. This was not in any plan that any of the other parties had been aware of. The archive's field personnel, observing the raider movement through their instruments, initially categorized it as a probable extraction attempt before recognizing that the direction was wrong for extraction. The coalition liaison, managing multiple simultaneous information streams, did not immediately register the raider movement as distinct from the general operational complexity developing around them. Moving toward an active Ark node in the middle of an engagement was objectively a very high-risk action. The people taking it understood this. The raider culture's approach to risk, which we discussed earlier, was not to minimize risk, but to make calculated decisions about what risks were worth taking given what was at stake. What these specific raiders understood themselves to be staking the risk against was, based on their partial archive information, significant enough to justify actions they would not have taken under other circumstances. The Ark's response to the approach of the raider group toward the node was one of the details that multiple observers noted and that the law flags as significant. The Ark units that were engaging coalition forces maintained that engagement. The units that were moving toward the fourth faction's position continued toward that position. But the units that would ordinarily have been positioned between the raider approach route and the node were not there. The space was clear in a way that should not have been possible, given the ARC unit concentration in the area. Whether this was because those units had been redeployed to other positions in the engagement, or because something about the current node state was affecting the positioning logic of units in the immediate vicinity, or because of something else that the law only gestures toward, is not established. The observable fact was that the approach route was clear and the raider group used it. The fourth faction's attempted interface was generating effects that were visible and measurable even from outside the immediate area. The equipment they were using was interacting with the node's architecture in ways that the node was responding to, which was itself the most significant thing that had ever been observed in relation to ARC infrastructure. The archives analysts were capturing data at a rate their systems were not designed to sustain, processing as much as they could in real time and logging the rest for later analysis. What the interface attempt was producing in terms of the node's behavior was a series of changes in the communication signatures that the archive's lead analyst described as sequential. The signatures were changing in a pattern that had structure, that was going somewhere, that was not simply intensifying, but was progressing through states that seemed to be building toward something. What that something was, the analysts did not know, but they noted the sequential quality as suggesting that the interface had not failed and had not simply had no effect. Something was happening. The ARC units that reached the fourth faction's position arrived before the coalition forces or anyone else could intercept them, and what happened at that position is one of the more fragmentary parts of the law record. The physical evidence, described in accounts from people who reached the position later, was consistent with the significant ARC engagement having occurred there. The fourth faction had not been simply wiped out, because what the law describes as being found at the position included evidence of sustained activity, not just bodies, but the faction's capacity to continue the interface attempt was disrupted. Whether the interface attempt was complete or interrupted became one of the central questions of the Bluegate aftermath, because the answer had significant implications for understanding what the node state was at the end of the events. An interrupted interface, depending on how far it had progressed, could have left the node's deeper system connections in a state that was neither closed nor opened, a potential condition that the archive's worst-case models had considered and found troubling. The coalition forces, having engaged the ARC units moving through their perimeter, pushed forward into the operational area rather than holding their defensive positions. This was a command decision made under pressure, possibly informed by the archive's emergency transmission and possibly informed by the developing understanding that passively holding a perimeter while significant things happened inside, it was not producing the outcomes the operation was supposed to produce. Pushing forward put the coalition forces into closer proximity to the node and into the operational space where the raider group was also moving. The coordination that had been established between coalition forces and the archive field personnel did not extend to the raider group, whose presence inside the restricted zone and movement toward the node had not been accounted for in coalition planning. The convergence of coalition forces and the raider group in the same operational space created a situation that neither had planned for. The ARC's response to the coalition advance was notable. The adaptive tactical behavior that had made the earlier engagement more costly than expected continued, but it was accompanied by something new. The light that had emanated from the node's primary structure intensified at specific points that corresponded, approximately, to the positions of the various human parties in the operational area. The archive's analysts observing this noted the spatial correlation and added it to the data stream they were already struggling to process. The archive's field personnel made a decision at this point to move from observation to active participation. They had the archive's contingency authorization, however ambiguously stated, and they had equipment that was relevant to the situation. The specific action they took was not an attack on ARC infrastructure, which was beyond their capability at the level they were authorized for. It was an attempt to use the archive's monitoring equipment in an active mode, transmitting toward the node rather than simply receiving from it. This active transmission was an attempt to communicate with the Ark, not in any language or format that had been established as effective, but using the signature structure that the archive's years of monitoring had characterized as the node's own communication format. The archive's analysts had developed a rudimentary model of that format over the years, informed by the years of monitoring data, and the field personnel were attempting to use that model to construct something that the node might recognize as a structured input. The attempt was not nothing. The monitoring data showed a response in the node's signature patterns to the archive's transmission, a response that was distinct from the pattern changes associated with the fourth faction's interface attempt and distinct from the baseline escalation associated with the broader situation. The archive's lead analyst, watching the data, noted the response and began attempting to read what the node was doing in response to what they had sent. What they read, or what their analysis pointed toward, was the beginning of the most significant event in the entire Bluegate story, one that none of the parties present had fully prepared for, and that the lore treats as the pivot of everything that followed. The node at Bluegate was not simply escalating its existing activity. It was not simply responding defensively to human interference. According to the archive's real-time analysis, based on the structural patterns of the communication signatures in this period, the node was making a decision. What that decision was and what it meant for the human parties at Bluegate and for the world beyond it is what we turn to next. Chapter 9. The node's decision and the final push. The concept of the node making a decision is one that the archive's lead analyst was careful to qualify extensively in their real-time notes, and the qualification matters for how we read what happened next. When they used the word decision, they were not claiming that the node was conscious or that the process they were observing was equivalent to human deliberation. They were using the word to describe an observed change in the node's operational state that had the structural characteristics of a conditional process, a system evaluating inputs and selecting between different possible outputs based on that evaluation. This is still a significant claim about the Ark's architecture. Standard Ark behavior, as modeled by the archive and by Raider operational experience, was not conditional in this sense. It was responsive to circumstances, but within narrow and predictable parameters. The behavior being observed at Bluegate was conditional in a more complex way, suggesting that the node's deeper system connections gave it access to a form of processing that standard surface units did not have. The inputs the node appeared to be evaluating, based on the signature analysis, included the fourth faction's interface attempt, the archive's active transmission, and what the analyst described as broader context inputs that were more difficult to characterize. The broader context inputs were what suggested to the analyst that the evaluation was not just responding to the immediate situation, but was drawing on a larger data set that included, possibly, the accumulated monitoring data about human activity that the lore had suggested Bluegate was gathering. While the archive's analyst was working through this interpretation, the operational situation around the node had developed further. The coalition forces had reached positions where they had clear engagement capability against the node's connective structures, the growing extensions from the node's base that had been the first observed sign of the phase transition. The coalition commanders were assessing whether to use that engagement capability. Using it would be a significant escalation. It would be the first direct human action against Bluegate's architecture, rather than against Ark units operating in the area. The archive's analysts had assessed that engaging the connective structures might impede or delay the transition process. It might also, in their worst-case modelling, accelerate it or trigger responses from the deeper systems that the node connected to. The ambiguity of the outcome projection was enormous. The Raider group that had approached the node had reached a position that the other parties found, when they later reconstructed the timeline, surprising. They were at the base of the node's primary structure, in contact with the architecture at the same location that the fourth faction had been targeting with their interface equipment. Whether they had come specifically to continue what the fourth faction had started, or whether their proximity to that location was coincidental, is a question the law leaves open in a way that feels deliberate. What the Raider group did at that position is the most debated element of the Blue Gate events in the law materials, because the available documentation is most fragmentary at exactly this point. The archive's instruments were recording everything in range, but the analysis of those recordings was being done in real time by people managing multiple simultaneous demands on their attention, and the documentation of exactly what happened at the node's base during the critical window is less clean than the documentation of the broader operational situation. The signal patterns that the archive's monitoring data shows during the critical window at the node's base include elements that are not explained by the fourth faction's earlier interface attempt and are not explained by the archive's active transmission. There are patterns in the data that point toward a third input source, one that was in physical contact with the node's architecture, rather than operating at distance. The most straightforward interpretation of this, and the one that the archive's later analysis endorsed, is that the Raider group was providing some kind of input to the node. The nature of that input, whether it was intentional or incidental, whether it was based on specific knowledge or on improvised action in the moment, and what the Raiders understood themselves to be doing, are all questions that the law does not fully answer. What the law does give you, through fragments of what appear to be personal accounts from people present, is the sense of having done something without fully knowing what they were doing, of acting on the basis of partial understanding and accumulated experience in a situation that was beyond any established framework, and of watching to see what happened next. What happened next was the node's decision resolving. The communication signatures, which had been in the complex, escalating pattern associated with the evaluation process, underwent a rapid structural change that the archive's analyst described as consolidation. The multiple overlapping pattern types collapsed toward a single, clearer output that was unlike anything in the baseline data. It was structured in a way that the analyst's models could not immediately decode, but it had a quality that the analyst, in their notes, described as resolution. The physical effects at the node accompanied the signature change. The light that had been emitting from the primary structure shifted in quality from the moving, patterned luminescence of the evaluation period to something steadier, more focused and directed. The direction it was focused in was, based on multiple observer accounts, approximately horizontal, toward the assembled human parties in the operational area. The arc units throughout the operational area stopped moving again, as they had at the beginning of the light event, with the same simultaneity that suggested a coordinated instruction rather than individual behavioral response. The engagement between coalition forces and arc units ceased not because the coalition forces stood down, but because the arc units were no longer engaging. The silence that followed was noted by every observer, inside and outside the operational zone. After the sustained chaos of the engagement period, the cessation of activity was disorienting in its completeness. The archive's instruments continued recording. The coalition forces maintained their positions. The raiders at the node's base did not move. The silence lasted long enough for the human parties to begin attempting to understand what it meant. The archive's analyst was running their models against the signature data as fast as the available processing allowed. The coalition commanders were in communication with each other, assessing the situation, not yet prepared to interpret the cessation as anything but a potential tactical pause. The raider groups were watching. Then the node did something that none of the analytical models had predicted and none of the parties present had prepared for. One of the connective structures that had been growing from the node's base over the previous period, one of the new extensions that had been the first sign of the phase transition, stopped growing, not all of them. One of them, the largest, the one that had extended furthest from the node, stopped, and then it began to retract. The retraction was slow at first, and the archives analyst noted it in the monitoring data before anyone outside the immediate node area could see it visually. The analyst's notes in this moment are worth quoting in the spirit they were written, which is the spirit of someone trying to accurately describe something extraordinary without overstating it. They wrote that the connective structure appeared to be withdrawing, that the material deposition process at the growing end had ceased and appeared to have reversed, and that the rate of change was consistent with a deliberate process rather than a degradation or a structural failure. The other connective structures did not immediately follow. They remained in their extended state, continuing whatever process they had been engaged in. But the retraction of the largest one was observed, processed, and debated by the parties in real time. The archives analyst offered an interpretation, carefully flagged as an interpretation, within minutes of the observation. The retraction, they suggested, might be understood as a response to the human inputs that the node had been evaluating, a conditional output based on that evaluation. If that was correct, then the node had effectively responded to something humans had done or said or provided, and the nature of the response was not hostile. Not hostile did not mean safe, and it did not mean good, and the analyst was careful about neither inferring nor suggesting those things. But not hostile was itself significant in the context of everything that had come before. The coalition commanders receiving the analyst's interpretation through the liaison channel had a decision to make. The engagement capability they had established against the connective structures was still in place. The question was whether the observed retraction changed the calculus about whether to use it. Different coalition members' representatives had different answers to that question. The debate was brief because the timeline did not allow for a lengthy deliberation, but it was real, and the answer that the coalition eventually arrived at was not unanimous. Chapter 10. The Turning Point. The decision that the coalition commanders made in the critical minutes after the connective structure's retraction was to hold, to not use the engagement capability against the remaining connective structures, to observe and assess before taking an action that could not be undone. This was not an obvious decision. There were strong arguments for acting on the engagement capability while it was available, before the situation changed in ways that might close that window. The worst-case models that the archives analysis had provided included scenarios in which the phase transition completing was catastrophic in ways that made disrupting the process, even at cost and risk, the better option. The people arguing for acting now were not wrong about the stakes they were weighing. The arguments for holding were grounded in the specific data that the analysts were providing in real time. The retraction of the connective structure was evidence that the node was responsive to human input in a way that made the situation less binary than the strike or no strike framework implied. If the node could retract, it could presumably continue to retract. If the continued retraction was contingent on continued human input, then understanding what input was producing the effect was more valuable than foreclosing the situation by destroying what they could reach. The archives field personnel receiving the coalition's decision to hold immediately escalated their own attempts to understand what had happened at the node's base during the critical window. The question of what the raider group had done needed an answer, because if the node's retraction was a response to that input, then replicating or extending that input was potentially the most important thing anyone could do in the current moment. The raider group, contacted through the communication systems that had been used to establish initial coordination, responded to queries about their actions at the node with accounts that the archives analysts found informative but incomplete. The raiders described physical contact with the node's architecture, using improvised interaction approaches that were based on their operational experience with arc structures rather than on any specific knowledge about Bluegate's particular characteristics. They had not known what they were doing in a technical sense. They had acted on the basis of accumulated field knowledge applied in an unprecedented situation. The archives analyst, working with the radar account and the monitoring data, developed an interpretation that held internal consistency and that the analyst found compelling. The radar's physical interaction with the node's architecture at the critical moment had not provided the node with technical information. It had provided the node with something more basic, the archives model of what the node's deeper function involved, the possibility that it was gathering and evaluating data about human populations and behavior suggested that the input it had received from the radar group was experiential rather than informational in the conventional sense. The things that the radar group had brought to the node in this interpretation were the accumulated product of years of surface experience, of navigating the environment that the Ark's presence had created, of surviving in proximity to Ark systems without becoming them, of maintaining a specific human relationship to the world the Ark was operating in. In the archives analysis, this was exactly the kind of data that the node's evaluation function had been designed to assess, and the radar group had provided it directly and at the highest possible resolution. This interpretation, if correct, had implications that reordered everything else about the situation. The node was not evaluating a tactical situation. It was not deciding how to respond to a military threat. It was doing something more fundamental, something that the archive's deepest research had been circling around, assessing whether the human populations in its operational environment were viable in a specific way that mattered to the Ark's deeper systems, and whether the phase transition it was undertaking should proceed in a form that included those populations or not. The retraction of the connective structure was in this reading not a tactical response to a specific action. It was an output of that deeper assessment, a signal that something about the evaluation had produced a result that modified the transition's trajectory. The archives analyst communicated this interpretation to all parties in the field using the emergency broadcast protocol that had already been used once. They were clear that it was an interpretation, that the evidence for it was real but not definitive, and that they could not guarantee it was correct. But they also communicated that if it was correct, the next steps were different from anything the current operational plans described. The coalition commanders, receiving this interpretation, had a second decision to make within a very short window. The first decision to hold was now being supplemented by a different question. Not just whether to strike, but what, if anything, to do given the possibility that the situation was something categorically different from what they had come prepared to address. The radar groups, receiving the same interpretation, had their own processing to do. The group that had been at the node's base had already acted on incomplete information and produced an effect that none of them fully understood. The other radar groups, positioned at different points in the operational area, were assessing whether there was anything they could do that was indicated by the new interpretation. The fourth faction's position remained unclear. The Ark units that had reached their position had not resumed movement after the general cessation of Ark unit activity. The situation at that position was unknown to the other parties and remained unknown for the remainder of the critical event period. What happened in the following hours was not the decisive military action that the coalition had come prepared to execute. It was something more complicated, more uncertain, and ultimately more significant. The archive field personnel and the radar group who had been at the node's base developed, through direct communication over the operational channels, a protocol for continued interaction with the node that built on the accidental effectiveness of the initial contact. This protocol was improvised under conditions that were the opposite of ideal for protocol development. The people developing it were working in an active Ark environment with incomplete information, under time pressure, and without the institutional backing of any established decision-making body. They were doing it because it seemed like the right thing to do, given what they understood about the situation, and because there was no established procedure for the situation they were actually in. The protocol involved continued physical contact with the node's architecture, combined with the archive's active transmission equipment, with the archive's analysts monitoring the node's responses in real time and providing feedback that informed the next inputs. It was iterative and uncertain and not fully controlled in any meaningful sense, but it produced observable effects in the node's signature patterns that the analysts could track and partially decode. Over the course of the following hours, while coalition forces maintained their positions and the operational situation held in a state of armed quiet, the node's connective structures continued to change. Not all in the same direction. 2 of the remaining extended structures continued their previous growth pattern, slower now, but continuing. 3 others began showing the retraction behavior that the largest had first exhibited, and 1 structure, at the opposite side of the node's base from where the raider group was positioned, developed a configuration that had not been observed in any of the monitoring data, one that the archive's analysts described as structurally distinct from any component type in the Ark architecture record. The distinct structure was small initially, but it was growing in a direction that was not aligned with any of the other structure's orientations, growing not outward from the node or downward into the ground, but upward, in a configuration that shaped the analyst's interpretation of it significantly. Something at Blue Gate was building something new. Whether that new thing was a threat or something else was, at the moment of its first observation, unknown. Everything that followed in the Blue Gate story orbited around that question and around the people at the node's base who were the closest human observers to the answer. Chapter 11. The Last Hours and What Was Revealed. The thing that was growing at Blue Gate's node did not grow quickly by any standard other than Ark infrastructure standards, which were not human construction standards. By Ark infrastructure standards, the growth rate was significant. The archive's monitoring data showed a progression of structural elaboration that the analyst characterized as accelerated, faster than the connective structure growth that had preceded it and more complex in its architecture. The coalition's hold decision remained in effect through the growth period. The commanders who had made it were under pressure from multiple directions. The archive's institutional leadership, finally fully engaged after the emergency broadcast had made the situation undeniable, was communicating directly with coalition command rather than through field channels, and the communications were complicated. The archive's leadership was not unified on the interpretation that the field analyst had provided, and the lack of institutional consensus was producing the kind of communication to coalition command that was technically accurate but not practically useful. The coalition command did not have the context to evaluate the competing archive interpretations effectively, because the context required years of investment in the specific research program that had produced them. What they had was field personnel reporting from the area, their own commanders' assessments of the operational situation, and a growing pressure from coalition member organizations who were monitoring the situation and had very different orientations toward what was happening. The raider group at the node's base continued their interaction protocol through this period. The fatigue involved was significant. The protocol required sustained attention and physical proximity to the node's architecture that were both demanding under the conditions. The people doing it were running on the operational endurance that raider culture built through long-term experience, but even that had limits. Communication between the raider group and the archive's field personnel during this period, logged in the monitoring data, has a quality that is distinct from the earlier operational communications. Earlier communications were focused on information exchange and coordination. The later communications, as the event extended, developed a different quality, something closer to the communication between people who are in a difficult situation together and who are no longer primarily in the mode of exchanging information, but are in the mode of holding each other in awareness. The archive's lead analyst, who'd been on continuous duty since the event began, produced an assessment of the growing structure that they sent directly to the archive's leadership and to Coalition Command simultaneously, outside of normal channels. This was not the first time in this event that the analyst had bypassed normal channels, and the cumulative effect of those decisions on their institutional standing would have consequences after the event. In the moment, they were making a judgment about where the information needed to go and how quickly. The assessment described the growing structure as having characteristics consistent with what the archive's deep research had theorized as a transition artifact, a physical expression of the node's state change that encoded information about the transition's outcome and direction. If the theory was correct, the structure was not just a byproduct of the transition, it was a record of it, and a record that potentially could be read by anyone with enough of the archive's analytical tools and the knowledge to use them. Coalition Command, receiving this assessment, asked the question that was obvious given the circumstances. Could the information in the structure be read? And what would it say? The analyst's answer was that reading it was potentially possible with the equipment available, that it would take time they might not have, and that they could not predict what the content would be before they read it. The analysis of the growing structure began while it was still growing, which was not an ideal condition for the work, but was the condition available. The archive's field personnel directed their monitoring equipment at the new structure and began the analysis process using the best tools they had. The results that came back were initially fragments, partial patterns, the kind of early data that required accumulation before it became interpretable. The coalition forces maintained their positions through this period. The ARC units throughout the operational area maintained their stationary positions. The node's communication signatures continued at the high level they had reached during the evaluation period, with the consolidation pattern still present and ongoing. The operational situation was stable in the sense of not escalating, but stable in the way of something that is waiting rather than something that has resolved. The specific content of the transition record, as it emerged from the accumulating analysis, is described in the law with a circumspection that is itself informative about the nature of what it contained. The analysts did not produce a clean readout of an intelligible message. What they produced was an interpretation of a data structure that required significant interpretive work to translate into anything that could be communicated in human terms, and the translation involved uncertainties at every step that the analysts were honest about. What the interpretation pointed toward, and what the analyst communicated to the archive's leadership and to Coalition Command in their final summary transmission from the field, was that the transition at Bluegate had included a conditional evaluation function, as the earlier analysis had suggested, and that the evaluation had produced an output state that was different from what the node's default trajectory had been. The default trajectory in the archive's model had been a complete phase transition that would have connected Bluegate's surface node to the deeper ARC systems in a way that completed a process the deeper systems had been building toward for the entire period of ARC activity on the surface. What that process was building toward was not fully characterized in the archive's model, but the aspects of it that were characterized were alarming enough that the archive's deepest level classification existed partly to manage how that information was distributed. The evaluation output had modified the trajectory, not reversed it, not stopped it, modified it. The modification meant that the connection to the deeper systems would complete in a form that was different from the default, different in ways that the growing structure encoded, but that the interpretation could not fully characterize from the data available in the field. What the modification represented, in the most human terms that the analyst could provide, was something between a held judgment and a changed destination. The Ark's evaluation at Bluegate had produced a result that altered what came next, not by preventing the transition, but by conditioning it on something that had been provided at the node's base by people who had not known what they were providing. The Coalition's response to this summary transmission was to ask what the practical, operational implications were. The analysts' answer was honest and unsatisfying. They did not know. The practical implications depended on what the modification to the transition meant in terms of the Ark's subsequent behaviour in the region and beyond, and that was not something they could predict from the data available. The hold remained in effect. The analysis continued. The node continued its process. And the people at Bluegate continued to be present in a situation that none of them had planned for and that none of them could fully see the end of from where they were standing. The hours that followed were among the most extensively documented in the available lore, paradoxically, because the reduced operational tempo meant that more people had time and attention for documentation. The accounts that survive from this period have a quality of careful attention to detail that the crisis period accounts do not have. People were watching closely and writing down what they saw because they understood, in the way that people sometimes understand when they are in the middle of something historical, that what happened here would matter to people who were not present, and that the accuracy of the record would matter. What they recorded was the gradual completion of the node's transition. The remaining connective structures that had been continuing their growth stabilized and then began retracting, following the pattern established by the largest structure earlier. The ones that had already begun retracting completed their retraction and were reabsorbed into the base architecture. The growing structure that had been developing throughout the event reached a certain size and then also stabilized. The communication signatures as the transition completed changed in a final and definitive way. The complex escalating pattern that had characterized the evaluation and transition period did not simply cease. It transformed into something that the archive's lead analyst described in their final field notes as unlike any baseline they had ever recorded. Not alarming in itself, not threatening in the way that heightened Archi operational activity was threatening. Simply different from what had been there before, in a way that suggested the system generating the signatures was now operating in a mode that had not existed before the events at Bluegate. The light from the node faded as the transition completed, not all at once, but gradually, over a period long enough for the observers to watch it go. The node's surface architecture, when the light was gone, was visibly different from what it had been before the transition began. Not dramatically different, not unrecognizable, but changed in ways that the careful observers on site could see, and that the monitoring data confirmed. The Arc units throughout the operational area, when the node's transition was complete, did not resume their previous activity patterns. They did something that was, for Arc units, unprecedented in the operational record. Over the course of the next several hours, they began to leave the area, not in the coordinated, directed way that characterized Arc deployment of units. Gradually, individually, in different directions, they moved away from Bluegate. Within a day of the transition completing, the density of Arc activity in the Bluegate region was lower than it had been at any point in the post-Arc period. What this meant for the region, and what it meant for the larger Arc system and its long-term behaviour, was not clear from Bluegate alone. It was a data point, the most significant data point in the accumulated record of human-Arc interaction, but it was one data point. Understanding what it pointed toward would require time and analysis that the people at Bluegate did not have and could not provide. What they had, in the aftermath of the events, was something simpler and more immediate. They were alive in a place that was less dangerous than it had been. They had been part of something that none of them fully understood, and they had a record, however fragmentary, of what had happened, which they would carry out of Bluegate into a world that would want to know. Chapter 12. The Aftermath and What Bluegate Changed. The immediate aftermath of the Bluegate events was managed by the major organisations involved in ways that reflected their characters, which is to say, not always well. The archive's institutional response was to begin the process of asserting control over the documentation and analysis of what had happened, consistent with the information management practices that had shaped their role in the events. The field personnel's emergency transmissions, including the classification-breaking broadcasts, became subjects of internal review that had consequences for the people who had sent them. The lead analyst's career with the archive after Bluegate was complicated in ways the law describes, with the kind of flat, specific detail that suggests familiarity with how institutions handle people who do the right thing in the wrong way, according to institutional procedure. The analyst was not sanctioned in any formal sense. They were moved to a different research assignment, one that was technically a promotion in title, but that removed them from the Bluegate analysis program at exactly the moment when their existing expertise was most relevant to the work. The coalition's response to the events was shaped by the diversity of its membership. Some coalition members saw the Bluegate outcome as a vindication of the whole decision, and as evidence that a different approach to ARC interactions was warranted. Others saw it as an anomaly that did not change the fundamental strategic picture, and that should not be allowed to distract from the continued development of capabilities to counter ARC operations by conventional means. These differences were real, and they produced genuine conflict within coalition institutions in the months following Bluegate. The raider group that had been at the node's base returned to their home community with accounts of what they had experienced that were, in the telling, difficult for people who had not been there to fully process. The challenge was not that the events were unbelievable in themselves. The challenge was that the events did not fit cleanly into any of the frameworks that the post-ARC world had developed for understanding the relationship between humans and the ARC, and frameworks matter for how you understand and communicate experience. The community reception of the Bluegate accounts varied. Older community members who had developed the firmest frameworks for understanding the ARC tended to have the most difficulty with the accounts, because what the accounts described was incompatible with the framework certainties they had been maintaining. Younger community members, and those whose frameworks had always been more provisional, found the accounts easier to integrate. This generational difference in reception mirrored a broader pattern in how the Bluegate events rippled outward through the surviving human world. The information ecosystem of that world was such that the Bluegate accounts spread faster than any of the major organizations wanted. The informal networks that moved information between communities were not controllable by organizations that had not invested in controlling them before the events, and the organizations that would have most wanted to control the Bluegate information had not made that investment. Within weeks, versions of the Bluegate story were circulating in communities that had no direct organizational connection to any of the parties involved. The versions circulating were, of course, incomplete and variable. The specific technical details of the archive's analysis were not part of what spread. What spread was the experiential core of the story, the fact that human presence at Bluegate, human behavior, human physical contact with the node's architecture, had produced a response from the ARC that changed what happened. This was the part of the story that was comprehensible across different communities' frameworks, because it spoke to something that the post-ARC world had been trying to figure out since the beginning: whether human action could matter in the face of the ARC. The answer that Bluegate suggested was yes, not in the way that the military-oriented thinkers had been trying to make it true, not through superior force or strategic disruption. In a different way, one that was harder to operationalize, but that was, the law suggests, felt as important by people across the spectrum of the surviving human world. Something about what it meant to be human, something that was specifically present in the raider group's accumulated experience and in the archive field personnel's years of patient attention, had registered at Blue Gate in a way that produced a meaningful response. The practical implications of this for subsequent human-arc interactions were the subject of more debate than could be summarized in a single chapter. The debate continues in the law's implied present, the period in which the game takes place. It has not been resolved, and perhaps cannot be resolved by debate alone. The evidence from Blue Gate is real but limited, and generalizing from a single event, however significant, to a comprehensive strategy is exactly the kind of thing that the post-arc world had learned to be careful about. The fourth faction's fate, as reconstructed from the fragmentary evidence available, was varied in ways that reflect the varied purposes that had brought different individuals within it to Blue Gate. Some of those individuals were not found after the events. The arc units that had reached their position had created a situation that the people who reached the position afterward found ambiguous in several respects. Some individuals from the faction were found alive in states that the people who found them found difficult to describe clearly. Some were found in conditions that told a different story. What the fourth faction's interface attempt had contributed to the events at Blue Gate, and whether any of what they had done had been part of the conditions that produced the outcome, is one of the questions that the law most deliberately leaves open. The archive's analysis of the monitoring data from the interface period had things to say about it that the archive's leadership classified at the highest available level and has not made available in any form accessible in the law materials collected here. The growing structure that had developed at the node's base during the events remained after the events were over. It did not change after the transition completed. It stood, a stable part of what Blue Gate's node had become after the transition, in a configuration that the archive's continued analysis has worked to understand. What the archive has understood from it, and whether that understanding has been shared with anyone outside the archive, is not established. Blue Gate itself, as a location, became in the aftermath what it had been in a different sense before, a place of concentrated human attention and significance, but for different reasons now. The raider operations that had previously treated it as a high-value, high-risk area continued, but the nature of the risk had changed. The arc activity that had made Blue Gate genuinely dangerous was reduced, sometimes dramatically, in the period following the events. Raider operators who worked the area after the events reported an environment that was more navigable, more legible in terms of arc behavior than any other high arc activity area they had experience with. Whether this was a permanent change or a temporary one is a question that the law acknowledges without resolving. The transition at Blue Gate had modified something. What the modification meant on the longer timescale of the arc's operations was not something that could be determined from the post-event data available. The arc was a system operating on scales that human observation, even at its most sophisticated, could only partially perceive. The people who had been at Blue Gate carried what they had experienced into the rest of their lives, as people carry significant experiences. The law's treatment of the post-Blue Gate period in the lives of the specific individuals present does not focus on grand resolution or settled understanding. It focuses on the more ordinary reality of people who have been through something and who live their lives in the context of what they have been through. The Raider group integrated back into their community's operations, carrying a reputation that preceded them in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes uncomfortable. The archive's field personnel returned to the archive's institutional structures, navigating those structures with the specific knowledge of what those structures were capable of, both at their best and at their worst. The coalition forces returned to their commands, having been part of something that was not in the coalition's operational doctrine, and that the doctrine would eventually, slowly, begin to incorporate. The survivors of the Blue Gate events were not defined by Blue Gate in the sense of being unable to move past it. They were defined by it in the more ordinary sense of having experienced something that was real and significant and that they did not forget. In a world that had required people to absorb loss and uncertainty continuously for years, the capacity to do this was not unusual. What was unusual was having an experience that, instead of simply adding to the weight, added something different. Something that was harder to name, but that the people who had it tended to describe in terms of what it felt like to matter